Hey guys, tonight we're heading underground, literally. Picture this. The air is thick, damp, and smells faintly of soil and firewood. The light's low, barely more than a flicker from a tallow candle tucked into a cracked clay holder. Around you, the earth walls close in, not in a horror movie way, but in a quiet, eerie hush that only deep silence can give. You're not in a cellar. You're not even in a cave. You're in a medieval dugout. Someone, maybe a farmer, maybe a monk, maybe a very desperate outlaw, carved this place out centuries ago. And yeah, you probably wouldn't survive this, not without a healthy fear of claustrophobia and a strong immune system. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps more than you'd think. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little channel travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's the Middle Ages. Pick a century, anywhere from the 9th to the 15th. Above ground, life is cold, chaotic, and deeply unstable. Your town's wooden walls won't stop raiders. Disease is a constant whisper behind every cough, and if your crops fail, well, you get to enjoy the taste of boiled tree bark and desperation stew. So, what do people do when the world outside becomes too much to bear? They dig. Not metaphorically, they literally dig. You find yourself crouching near the edge of a shaded hillside, barely noticeable except for a shallow depression in the ground and a bit of brush that doesn't quite match the landscape. Push that aside and you'll reveal a small entrance, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through. It's the kind of place you wouldn't give a second glance to if you weren't looking for it. Intentionally so. This isn't just shelter. It's secrecy wrapped in survival. These early dugouts weren't elaborate at first. A single chamber, maybe 4 feet high, just enough to hunch in, and carved into soft soil or chalky hillside. Think of it as the medieval version of a studio apartment, if your apartment came with dirt walls and the constant threat of collapse. Yet even at this basic level, the dugout served a vital purpose. It was hidden. And in a world where visibility often meant vulnerability, invisibility was its own kind of armour. What's wild is how widespread these shelters became. From the windswept plains of Eastern Europe to the wooded hills of Britain, evidence of underground living pops up in the most unexpected places. And archaeologists are still trying to decode the full story. Some say they were peasant homes during especially harsh winters. Others believe they were meant as temporary hideouts during times of war. And then there are the outlier theories, like the idea that some were used for initiation rites or occult gatherings. No one agrees completely, which makes them all the more fascinating. One of the oldest examples sits in the Ukrainian village of Oleshkivka. There, you can still find the remains of a system of earth homes carved beneath a forest ridge. Half-buried chambers with carefully reinforced walls and air shafts. It's not just a hole someone dug in a panic. It's planned. Someone sat down, probably with a stick and a lot of curses, and figured out how to keep their family safe beneath the surface for weeks at a time. And then there's the legend of the priest holes in England. These came later, during the Reformation, when Catholic clergy had to hide from Protestant authorities. They weren't always underground, but some were. One in particular, hidden beneath an old manor house in Worcestershire, drops down into a dirt chamber so tight you have to wiggle in sideways. Imagine crouching in there for hours, maybe days, with only stale bread and the sound of guards' boots on the floor above. That's not just dedication, that's medieval-level panic room strategy. But dugouts weren't always about fear. Sometimes they were just practical. In Iceland, turf houses were half buried into hillsides to shield from freezing winds. The ground insulated better than any wooden wall could. In these, families slept, cooked, and sang songs about winter gods while the earth held the warmth inside. Dugout living wasn't necessarily a last resort. It could be a clever, eco-friendly design before eco-friendly was even a word. Still, the image most of us carry when we think of medieval dugouts is darker. Picture refugees during a siege, digging with bare hands and wooden bowls to create a chamber beneath a barn. Smoke would be filtered through moss and damp cloth. Food had to be hauled in and rationed like gold, and if you made a noise too loud, just one slip of the tongue or scrape of a plate, it could mean discovery. One peculiar find comes from France. where a chamber carved beneath a vineyard contained an entire wall of tally marks, hundreds of tiny vertical lines scratched into stone. Some scholars think they were counting days. Others believe it might have been a record of inventory, or even something ritualistic. But standing there now, staring at those etched lines, it's impossible not to wonder who stood there scratching them into the rock, and what they were waiting for. There's also the question of who built these spaces. Not everyone could swing a pickaxe or handle the architectural challenges of hollowing out earth without causing a deadly collapse. So, were there medieval specialists? Secretive builders for hire? Or was it more of a community effort, each person taking shifts under the cover of night? We don't really know, and that mystery, like the soil above these long-forgotten chambers, still hasn't fully been unearthed. But you're in one now, for tonight at least, crouched in this space that smells of damp wool and smoke, listening to the world above move on, unaware of the silent lives that once burrowed below. You feel the weight of earth above your head, the heartbeat hush of enclosed spaces, and the strange comfort of walls that whisper secrets no one else will ever hear. You start to understand that going underground in the Middle Ages wasn't some quirky lifestyle choice. It was desperation wrapped in strategy, shaped by seasons of terror, bad harvests, and the looming spectre of armed strangers marching over the next hill. So the question is, why? Why would someone go through the immense labour of carving out a life below the surface when living above ground was already hard enough? Turns out there were a lot of reasons, and none of them particularly comforting. At the core of it all is one basic motivation: safety. The medieval world didn't exactly come with insurance policies. If your village got raided by Vikings, brigands, feuding lords, or some faction in yet another pointless succession war, you were on your own. And if you weren't fast enough or smart enough to vanish, well, you became property, a statistic, or worse. So dugouts weren't always planned months in advance. Sometimes they were desperation bunkers, dug fast with shaking hands as the sounds of hoofbeats and war horns drew closer. Then there were the political shifts. When kingdoms changed hands or new religions took over, entire populations found themselves unwelcome overnight. You were Catholic in a Protestant reign. You hid. You were the wrong ethnicity in a newly drawn border. You really hid. Underground chambers became sanctuaries for priests, persecuted families, and anyone caught on the wrong side of a holy decree. But sometimes the enemy wasn't people, it was nature. Think harsh winters in Eastern Europe where the temperature dropped low enough to freeze your livestock in place. Above ground, you'd shiver yourself into an early grave. Below ground, if built correctly, the dugout stayed just above freezing, warm enough to survive. That constant temperature regulation, thanks to the insulating properties of soil, turned underground living into a surprisingly viable option. In fact, some families preferred it. Humble, sure, but warm, quiet, safe-ish, and let's not forget famine. When the crops failed, and they often did, people didn't just go hungry, they panicked. Grain hoarders would vanish into secret underground pantries. Families would hollow out chambers beneath barns to hide what little food they had from neighbours or tax collectors. Some even sealed off entrances completely, living inside their dugouts for weeks, sometimes longer, hoping to avoid both starvation and suspicion. Of course, if your ventilation was poor or you forgot to reinforce your support beams, you might get your wish in a much more permanent way. In one recorded case in Bohemia, locals recalled rumours of a family who vanished during a particularly brutal winter. A century later, during the clearing of a field, a partially collapsed chamber was discovered beneath an ancient apple tree. Inside were the remains of 5 people, 2 adults and 3 children, huddled around a pile of ash and broken pottery. No one knows what happened to them, only that they died in silence, hidden beneath the very ground they trusted to keep them safe. There's also the military angle. Medieval warfare wasn't clean lines and gallant knights. It was siege, starvation, and brutality. During prolonged attacks, civilians often dug beneath their own homes to create storage rooms or makeshift shelters. Some even tunnelled under castles or monasteries in hopes of finding hidden exits or collapsing enemy walls. These tunnels, while not always intended as living spaces, became temporary shelters nonetheless. You can picture it. Damp, pitch black, the sound of pickaxes echoing in the silence, and the occasional rumble from above as the battle raged on. Nobody slept well down there. But here's where it gets a bit weirder. Not every dugout was purely defensive or utilitarian. Some had religious purposes. In regions where old pagan beliefs still lingered beneath a thin coat of Christianity, underground spaces were used for rituals, initiations, and private worship. Imagine crawling through a narrow tunnel lit only by a flickering torch to reach a round chamber with a carved altar and crude symbols scratched into the walls. Whether you were praying, summoning, or just trying to connect with something beyond the reach of the surface world, these chambers held a power the open sky never could. There's even a story, admittedly fringe but deliciously odd, about a group of anchorites in the 13th century who sealed themselves into underground cells beneath a monastery. The idea: to live in total isolation for decades, cut off from temptation and distraction, fed through a hole in the wall by monks who hopefully remembered they were down there. One such chamber was found with walls completely covered in charcoal sketches, animals, stars, and one figure that appeared to have wings and 6 fingers. Scholars still can't agree if it was a hallucination or just some medieval guy with a lot of time on his hands. And here's the kicker. Sometimes going underground wasn't about fear or function. It was about hiding from history itself. In times when records could be erased, where entire villages could disappear after a raid, a dugout might be the only evidence that someone had once lived, hoped, and tried to outsmart fate. A secret life beneath the surface, carved in silence. It's oddly poetic, isn't it? The idea that while kings built their castles tall and wide, entire communities were building sideways and downward, into the soil, into the shadows. Their stories aren't in scrolls or stained glass. They're in the texture of compacted earth, the soot on stone ceilings, the worn grooves where hands clutched for balance. And those stories are still being uncovered, sometimes quite literally by archaeologists with shovels and puzzled expressions. You pause, imagining what it would feel like to choose to vanish into the ground. Not as an act of surrender, but of rebellion, of survival. To create a world where prying eyes couldn't follow. A place so hidden that even time had to work to find it again. So, next time you see a suspicious dip in the land or a strange outcropping of rocks, don't dismiss it too quickly. You might just be walking over someone's last stand or their only sanctuary, and let's be honest, you'd never know. That's kind of the point. Let's say you've made the big, life-altering decision to disappear underground. Not metaphorically, no, you're going full mole person mode. But before you start digging like a maniac, there's one major question to answer. Where are you going to dig? And don't say anywhere. Because medieval folks, they knew better. They didn't just start clawing at the nearest hillside and hope for the best. The choice of dirt, soil, terrain, the very bones of the earth, mattered more than you might think. You're standing there, eyeing a gentle slope at the edge of the village. The sheep graze lazily nearby, and a copse of trees cast just enough shade to keep things discreet. Looks ideal, right? Wrong. Because if that slope is made of a loose topsoil or heavy clay, your new home will be either collapsing on your head or slowly turning into a mud coffin. That's a hard no from the medieval survival playbook. Instead, the ideal soil is firm but carvable, something like loose, a fine, compacted silt often found in parts of Europe and Asia. It's stable, it holds its shape well, and it doesn't crumble at the first sign of moisture. In fact, some of the most extensive underground dwellings ever discovered, like those in the Ukrainian Dnipro Valley, were dug into loose banks. Entire networks of rooms, staircases, and smoke tunnels still sit preserved in that dense yellowish earth like time capsules. The people who built them knew what they were doing, and if you didn't have loess, you looked for chalk, soft sandstone, or even compact clay mixed with gravel. Anything that could be dug with basic tools but wouldn't betray you mid-snore by caving in. One of the quirkiest sites unearthed in Germany showed signs of builders testing the soil first, digging small trial holes and filling them back in. Kind of like a geotechnical survey, only without laser levels and hard hats. Just your Uncle Gernot, poking the ground with a stick and muttering, "Too damp." Hillsides were especially prized, not just because they were easier to dig into horizontally, which, let's be honest, saved your back, but because the slope helped with drainage. Rainfall would slide off the hill, while your entrance, tucked just above the base, stayed relatively dry and hidden. But there was a trade-off. Dig too high, and your chamber would be exposed. Dig too low, and water would find its way inside. This is why many medieval dugouts are found mid-slope, right in the sweet spot between visibility and flood risk. Camouflage also played a role in site selection. The best dugouts were the ones no one noticed. Builders often chose areas near rock outcroppings, clusters of bushes, or thick forest to help mask the entrance. Some even built in places other people avoided, like old pagan sacred grounds or supposedly haunted woods. After all, if the average peasant was terrified of angry forest spirits or ghostly monks, that meant fewer visitors, fewer questions, and less chance of someone stumbling across your hideaway. And don't forget access. You needed to be close enough to gather firewood, forage for food, or keep tabs on the village, but not so close that smoke from your chimney slit gave you away. That balance, connected but unseen, was critical. A little too far, and you'd freeze or starve. A little too close, and you'd get burned at the stake for harbouring secrets. It was like playing hide and seek, where the stakes were eternal damnation or decapitation, instead of just getting tagged. One particular underground site in Poland was found beneath what's now a sheep pasture. The entrance, hidden under a stone that looked like a natural part of the terrain. But once lifted, it revealed a narrow shaft leading down to a set of carved stone steps, and a surprisingly cosy chamber complete with soot-blackened ceiling and ventilation slits carved in a neat, triangular pattern. Archaeologists believe the spot was chosen because the nearby stream disguised any human sounds, and the rocky surface above the chamber gave excellent structural support. Basically, it was the medieval version of an Airbnb with 5-star reviews for privacy and natural white noise. Now here's where things get interesting. Some people intentionally picked unstable soil, not because they were dumb, but because they wanted the place to be temporary, like a kind of a one-time panic room. If the structure collapsed after a few uses, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it served its purpose during that crucial week when the local militia swept through or the plague hit and you needed to quarantine in a hurry. Disposable dugouts, not the safest idea, but hey, when your choices are dirt chamber or death, you stop being picky. There's still some debate among historians about how much site choice was luck versus knowledge. Did medieval peasants really understand soil composition in a scientific way? Not quite, but centuries of living close to the land gave them something almost better. Instinct. They knew which ground swallowed carts during heavy rain. They saw where trees grew shallow roots. They understood the language of the earth through generational memory and quiet observation. Maybe they couldn't explain sediment, layers, but they knew where to dig and where to walk away. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of the perfect spot. If you were on the run or facing invasion, you dug where you could. Beneath a hay pile, inside a crumbled barn, even under floorboards. These last-minute holes were less about clever engineering and more about sheer will to disappear. Some were never finished. Others collapsed, trapping people inside. A few became unintentional tombs, sealed by war or time or simply forgotten. A particularly haunting case comes from rural Hungary, where a cluster of what looked like ancient animal dens turned out to be shallow dugouts, some only 4 feet long, just big enough for a curled-up human body. Inside one was a rusted iron cross, a broken comb, and the skeletal remains of a woman in her 20s. No one knows her name. Maybe she chose the wrong patch of earth, or maybe, in her time, it was the only patch she had. So yeah, choosing the right dirt wasn't just about craftsmanship. It was life and death, hope and fear. Every shovel of soil lifted was a gamble. Every foot deeper was a bet that the earth would hold, that the world above wouldn't notice, and that whatever chased you couldn't crawl down after you. Next time you feel the ground beneath your feet, take a second. Imagine it not as a surface, but a shelter, a secret. A whole other world just a few feet down, waiting to be uncovered, or forever hidden. So you've picked your perfect hillside. Firm soil, natural cover, not too wet, not too dry. Goldilocks would approve. Now comes the fun part, figuring out how to get in and out of your medieval mole home without being noticed. Because let's face it, the best underground hideaway in the world is completely useless if someone sees you slipping into it like you're late for a secret meeting with a druid. This is where medieval folks got real creative, with entrances, exits, and the fine art of making yourself invisible. The entrance to a dugout was always the weakest link in the secrecy chain. Think about it. If someone finds the door, the game's up. So it had to blend into the surroundings perfectly. That meant no neat paths leading to it, no obvious tracks, and certainly no smoke puffing out like a woodland chimney. Entrances were often tucked under brush, disguised by tree roots, or hidden behind a movable rock or pile of firewood. Sometimes it was as simple as a thick animal hide curtain covered in mud and moss that blended with the forest floor. One clever technique involved using a hollowed-out log as a fake tree stump. Step on it in just the right way, and it tilted to reveal a tunnel below. Like a trapdoor, but make it medieval. You can imagine some hunched figure, maybe a weary farmer or an outlaw priest slipping into the shadows, crouching beneath a tangle of vines and vanishing into the earth like a ghost. If you weren't watching with the eyes of a hawk, you'd never notice, and that was the point. If an invading soldier saw nothing but trees and grass, the dugout worked. If he stopped, sniffed the air and muttered, "That bush looks suspicious," well, time to crawl deeper and hope the escape tunnel holds. Some entrances were built vertically like wells, with ropes or carved footholds leading down. These were especially popular when dugouts were built beneath homes or barns. You'd lift a trapdoor in the floorboards and disappear into a narrow shaft, the kind that made you question your diet and your claustrophobia in equal measure. This had its perks. It was easy to hide and harder to detect. But if you twisted your ankle halfway down, that was your new home for the foreseeable future. Then there were sloped tunnels. These were more common in hill or embankment dugouts, angled just enough to walk or crawl down, sometimes with carved steps, sometimes slick with mud, always dark and close. You'd enter through a disguised opening at the base of a tree or behind a bush, and within seconds the sounds of the outside world would muffle behind you. No light, no wind, just your breath, your heartbeat, and the soft scrape of your hands on earthen walls. And let's talk doors, or rather the lack of them. A medieval dugout wasn't going to have a front door with a handle and a welcome mat. More often, it had a plug-style entrance, a tight-fitting slab of wood or stone, sometimes covered with dirt or straw, wedged into the opening like a cork in a bottle. On the inside, it might have a loop of rope or a wooden latch to pull it closed. On the outside, it looked like just another part of the landscape. You didn't knock. You didn't even know it was there unless someone showed you. One fringe discovery in the Czech Republic involved a false path system, an entrance hidden under an animal pen, complete with fake hoofprints to draw attention away. Researchers found the dugout only after a collapsed tunnel revealed what had been an entire underground chamber, just steps from a centuries-old barn. The clever bit? They'd built a decoy trail leading in the opposite direction, complete with broken tools and ashes to suggest someone had recently camped there. Misdirection at its finest. But entrances weren't just about hiding, they had to be functional too. That meant angled just right to prevent flooding during heavy rain. Some had shallow drainage trenches carved just below the threshold, filled with gravel or broken pottery to keep water from seeping in. Others were elevated slightly, forcing you to climb in and down, which kept the wet out but didn't do much for your knees. It was always a trade-off, stealth versus comfort, dryness versus accessibility. Then there's the issue of who was allowed to know where the entrance was. These locations were often tightly held secrets, passed down through families or shared only with the most trusted companions. In some cases, they were so well hidden that when the owner died or was captured, the entrance was lost for good. That's why, even today, farmers occasionally stumble upon collapsed chambers while ploughing, surprised to find a forgotten room filled with soot, pottery shards, and sometimes bones, all sealed away behind what looked like just another lump of earth. And if one entrance was good, two was better. Many well-built dugouts had a secondary exit, typically much smaller and better hidden than the first. These escape routes might lead to a nearby thicket, a dry riverbed, or even emerge inside a storage shed or stone wall. Crawling through one of these meant getting muddy, bruised, and probably a little panicked. But in a siege or raid, that tight, pitch-black tunnel could be the difference between vanishing or being dragged out. There's an old tale from the Baltic coast about a woman who escaped a siege by leading her children through an escape tunnel beneath their cellar, one that opened nearly a quarter-mile away under a pile of driftwood. For years after, locals said you could still hear faint cries coming from the collapsed passage when the wind blew just right. Of course, it's probably superstition, or maybe just the earth settling, but it's the kind of story that clings to a place long after the tunnel's gone. Scholars still debate whether some entrances were intentionally made to be sealed permanently, used once during a time of crisis and then abandoned. A few even speculate that some dugouts were designed to be completely cut off from the surface, with only vertical air shafts and rope-fed supply holes. Living in such a space would have required serious planning and a near superhuman ability to deal with tight quarters. The idea is not totally proven, but some of the strangest excavated chambers have entrances too small or too complex to make regular use seem likely. Were they ritual spaces, death traps, just over-engineered hideouts? No one knows for sure. All you know is this: if you're going to live underground, the entrance is your lifeline and your greatest liability. It has to be invisible, clever, dry, and just barely human enough to feel like a doorway instead of a grave. Once it's sealed behind you, the world above becomes a rumour. The path back up is as narrow as your options, and that's exactly how it was meant to be. Now that you've chosen your spot and disguised your entrance like some medieval ninja, it's time to get to the gritty business of digging. And let's just say this up front: it is not glamorous. You're not striding in with a crew and a blueprint, wearing a tool belt and nodding at some foreman named Greg. No, you're down on your knees, in a hole, scraping at the earth with tools so basic they'd make a modern-day toddler's sandbox set look advanced. And yet, somehow, entire families manage to carve out entire rooms, tunnels, storage spaces and ventilation shafts with little more than sweat, patience and a working knowledge of physics, or maybe just a stubborn refusal to die above ground. So what were the tools of the trade? Mostly wooden shovels, iron-tipped picks and stone hammers. In some cases, antler tines were used, especially for finer work like shaping walls or widening tight corners. These weren't power tools, they were handmade, often by the same people who used them. A blacksmith might make the iron tips for pickaxes, but if you were poor, you might be using whatever scrap metal you could find, bound to a wooden shaft with strips of rawhide or braided rope. Effective? Sure. Comfortable? Absolutely not. Digging was done in stages. First, a shallow trench was carved horizontally into the hillside or vertically down through the earth, depending on your chosen layout. This initial space was usually just big enough to crawl into. Claustrophobia highly recommended. Once inside, workers would widen the tunnel slowly, scraping away at the sides and sealing inch by inch. The loosened soil had to go somewhere, of course, so buckets, baskets, or even old cloaks were used to haul it out. And all of that had to be done without making too much noise, especially if you were digging during a time of war or persecution. You can picture it. Someone inside, hunched over in the flickering light of a smoky tallow lamp, carving away at a wall with a pickaxe that's more rust than iron. Outside, another person stands watch while two others take turns hauling away buckets of dirt to dump it discreetly near the riverbank or scatter it in the forest. This process took days, weeks, sometimes longer. It wasn't efficient, but it was persistent, and that's how medieval folks got things done. Slowly, painfully, and with an awful lot of blisters. What's remarkable is how well some of these dugouts were engineered, given the primitive tools. The walls were often carved with a slight inward angle to prevent collapse, an instinctive understanding of load-bearing design that's still used in modern tunnel work. In areas with crumbly or sandy soil, builders lined the interior with wooden beams or wattle panels daubed in clay. These acted like primitive scaffolding, keeping the roof from falling in and giving the space a more permanent, structured feel. One of the more curious discoveries from a site in northern France was a set of digging tools buried alongside the entrance shaft, perhaps a builder's personal stash, hidden for later use. Among them was a narrow, spoon-shaped digging blade made from deer antler and a tiny, sharpened bronze chisel. It raised a few eyebrows. Why a chisel? Why so small? Some suggest it was for carving symbols or hidden markings inside the dugout. Others think it may have been ceremonial, or even a child's tool. The truth, as usual, is buried with the dirt. Digging also had to be strategic. If you went too deep, you risked water seepage or collapsing the chamber. Too shallow, and you'd hear every footstep above and be heard in return. Some clever builders created a slight arch in the ceiling to distribute weight, while others dug channels above the living space to divert any moisture from soaking the roof. Imagine doing all of this in the dark, with only your gut instinct and a sputtering flame to guide you. And speaking of flames, fire was both a tool and a threat. In some cases, builders used a method known as fire setting, where they'd light small controlled fires against a stubborn rock face to crack it from the heat. After cooling it with water, the rock would become brittle and easier to remove. This was borrowed from ancient mining techniques, and only used when absolutely necessary, since smoke, fire and enclosed spaces don't exactly mix well. Still, it's evidence of the lengths people went to just to carve out a little more space. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. There are plenty of stories, some documented, others just whispered in village pubs, about unfinished chambers, sudden collapses, and workers buried alive mid-dig. In some cases, bones have been found sealed behind collapsed tunnel walls, their owners forever caught in the middle of a home improvement project gone very wrong. Grim, yes, but also a reminder that for every successful dugout there were probably 3 failures quietly erased by time and soil. Now, let's talk about teamwork. A solo digger could do some damage, but real progress came from group efforts. Families, neighbours, even small religious communities would band together to dig over the course of several nights. There's something quietly heroic about that. Half-starved villagers taking turns under a moonless sky, dirt under their nails and fear on their breath, carving out a refuge 1 inch at a time. No blueprints, no instructions, just a shared hope that the next swing of the pick wouldn't be their last. There's ongoing debate among historians about whether these projects were always purely for shelter. Some argue that many of these chambers, particularly the more carefully built ones, were created not as temporary hideouts, but as long-term living spaces, or even sacred places. The level of craftsmanship in some suggests a purpose beyond mere survival. Still, others point out that necessity often pushes people into acts of unexpected ingenuity. Just because a dugout looks beautiful now doesn't mean it wasn't carved in a panic by desperate hands. So, there you are, inside your hand-dug chamber. Dirt in your hair, arms aching, every muscle protesting, but alive. Safe, at least for now. The roof holds, the walls are solid, and you did it all with a pickaxe that wouldn't pass modern safety inspections, and a will that could crush stone. Congratulations, you've officially joined the secret club of medieval diggers, people who knew that when the world fell apart the best thing to do was bury yourself under it. Alright, so, you've dug your hideout. The walls are solid, the entrance is hidden, and you haven't accidentally buried yourself alive yet. So far, so good. But now there's another, less obvious problem creeping up on you. Air. Specifically, the complete lack of it. You're now several feet below the surface, sealed into a space designed to be invisible. And invisible, unfortunately, tends to also mean airtight. That cosy, silent chamber of yours, it's about to become a medieval death trap unless you figure out how to breathe. Breathing underground isn't optional, it's survival 101. And yet, the minute you start closing off entrances and hiding smoke and sound, you're sealing yourself inside with stale, used-up air and rising carbon dioxide. Even with a single candle burning, the oxygen can drop fast. So how did people in the Middle Ages pull this off without modern fans, vents, or a solid understanding of respiratory science? Well, it turns out they had tricks. Old, clever, dirt-stained tricks passed down through generations of people who didn't need to understand the theory of airflow to know that if you didn't build a vent, you died. Simple as that. Most dugouts used one of 2 primary methods: vertical shafts or angled ventilation tunnels. Vertical shafts were the classic go-to, essentially narrow holes dug straight up from the chamber to the surface, often hidden among rocks, tree roots, or the bases of bushes. They didn't have grills or fans, but they didn't need them. Warm air from inside the chamber would naturally rise, drawing in cooler air from any lower entrance or hidden crack. It's the same principle that makes smoke go up a chimney, just without the chimney sweep and top hat. These shafts were often as narrow as a fist or as wide as a bread loaf, depending on the size of the chamber and how many people were expected to be breathing in there. Some were even camouflaged with loosely placed stones or brush to keep them hidden. And yes, that meant that a sudden rainstorm could dump water right into your breathing hole. But many builders figured this out and added crude overhangs made from bark, sticks, or bits of cloth to redirect the flow. Not elegant, but it worked. Then there were horizontal or angled ventilation tunnels, dug separately from the entrance and rising gently upward to the surface. These were harder to create because they had to be just right. Too steep, and they were unstable. Too flat, and airflow stalled. But when done correctly, they acted like secret airstrips, pulling in fresh air without drawing attention. Some clever builders would even dig 2 tunnels, one for intake, one for exhaust, creating a passive airflow system that could keep a chamber fresh for days. There's archaeological evidence of some ventilation shafts being lined with stones or wood to keep the walls from collapsing. One particularly fascinating find from Ukraine showed a vent shaft that had been fitted with a layer of woven twigs and clay, a primitive filter, possibly designed to block insects or dust, or maybe it was just there to stop squirrels from dropping acorns into the chamber. Either way, it was smart and resourceful, because when you're living under a pile of dirt, every breath counts. But as with all things medieval, ventilation wasn't foolproof. There are grim stories of people found in collapsed dugouts with no obvious cause of death, no wounds, no evidence of cave-in, just gone. Some scholars suggest those may have been the victims of oxygen deprivation or carbon monoxide build-up from cooking fires. Which brings us to another delightful challenge of underground life: heat. See, in most climates, especially in northern Europe or the steppe regions, going underground protected you from wind and rain, but not from the cold seeping in through the earth itself. Temperatures inside a dugout might stay stable, but they weren't exactly toasty. So people used small fires, tiny, controlled flames in clay bowls or simple stone hearths, to warm themselves or cook. But fire eats oxygen, and in a sealed space that's like inviting a hungry guest to share your last meal and your last breath. This is where the balance between warmth and airflow became delicate. Builders had to create chimney vents that could draw smoke upward without advertising the presence of a hidden home. Some used tall, narrow shafts stuffed with moss and stones to disperse smoke slowly and high above the tree line. Others fed fires only at night, when the smoke would be less visible. There are even signs that some dugouts used rock-lined heat pits, stones heated outside the chamber, and then brought in to slowly release warmth without using fire at all. Primitive? Yes. Clever? Absolutely. One fringe theory involves the use of animal bladders or thin stomach membranes stretched across ventilation shafts to create one-way airflow, allowing air to pass in or out but blocking visibility or insects. There's no solid proof of this yet, but bits of animal membrane have been found in strange places during excavations, so the idea is not entirely far-fetched. And honestly, if anyone could MacGyver a survival solution out of cow parts and dirt, it was medieval peasants. There's still academic debate about how much these communities understood about airflow. Some argue they just copied what worked and didn't really know why it worked. Others think they had a rudimentary understanding passed through oral tradition on how to listen to the dugout, watching how smoke drifted, noticing when candles burned dim, feeling for drafts. You didn't need a thermometer when your lungs told you everything you needed to know. And then there's the issue of who got the good air. In larger chambers, say, used by whole families or religious groups, the best ventilated spots were usually reserved for the elders or the sick. Kids and able-bodied adults might sleep closer to the back, where air was thinner and smoke hung low. A little grim, sure, but in survival mode, these decisions weren't about comfort. They were about who needed to last the night. One peculiar discovery in a Cornish dugout was a tiny side chamber, carved just above the main room and accessible only by a small ladder. Initially thought to be storage, it had soot on the walls and fragments of burned bone. Now some believe it may have been used as a smoke room, a place to light a fire away from the living quarters, allowing warmth and cooked food without flooding the main chamber with smoke. Others argue it was a ritual space or even a form of early sauna. Scholarly consensus? Still up in the air, much like the airflow it was probably designed to manage. So now you're lying there in your underground sanctuary wrapped in a blanket, a tallow lamp flickering nearby, and the faint whisper of air moving through the shaft above. You've figured it out, how to breathe beneath the earth. No fanfare, no technology, just you, the dirt, and a few cleverly carved holes keeping you alive. The medieval world didn't hand out comfort, it handed out problems, but somehow people made it work, one breath at a time. You're cozy now, sort of. You've got walls, a roof, and a steady supply of breathable air. Congratulations, you're not suffocating. But let's not pop the mead just yet, because there's another beast lurking in the shadows, silent and patient. Water. Not a refreshing glass of it either. We're talking mud, seepage, pooling rain, and damp that clings to your clothes, your skin and your bones like a second, colder skin. You're underground. Gravity is working against you. And unless you've planned for it, your snug little haven is going to become a soggy, slow-motion disaster. Waterproofing a medieval dugout was less about stopping water entirely and more about managing it. Because let's face it, if you're living inside a hill or below the frost line, water's going to try to find you. Especially after rain, when the ground turns into a sponge, pressing moisture into every crack and gap. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, and you must, is to outsmart the water. And medieval people, bless their muddy boots, got real creative with how they did that. First rule, elevation matters. The floor of your chamber could not be the lowest point in your setup. If it was, congratulations, you just invented the world's saddest indoor wading pool. That's why most dugouts were carved slightly uphill from the entrance, with a shallow slope leading outward. It sounds simple, but that tiny incline helped redirect water down and out. It was the equivalent of medieval drainage engineering, basic but life-saving. Then there were drainage trenches. Usually no more than a hand-width deep, these narrow ditches lined the perimeter of the dugout and led toward a hidden exit point, often somewhere just outside the main chamber. Builders would fill these trenches with gravel, shards of broken pottery, or even just layers of dry twigs to keep them from clogging with mud. The goal was to give water an obvious escape route, because if you didn't, it would make one on its own, usually right through your bedding. Some of the more advanced setups included soak pits, small basins dug outside the dugout's entrance and filled with porous material. Rainwater would drain here first before even thinking about entering your home. In areas with heavier rainfall, a moat system might be carved, essentially a low trench circling the dugout to intercept runoff before it reached the walls. We're not talking castle moats here, just a few inches deep, enough to handle the daily insults of nature. Simple, elegant, and probably tripped over constantly in the dark. As for the walls themselves, waterproofing was all about materials. If you had access to clay, you could smear a thick layer over the raw dirt walls to seal in moisture. Think of it like ancient plaster, but with more squish. Some people added straw animal hair to the mix to give it more strength and flexibility. Others layered the clay over wattle panels, woven wooden slats stuck into the ground and daubed with this sticky mud mix. These panels held the wall together, kept the dirt from crumbling, and helped block moisture from seeping in too fast. Bonus, they also made it look slightly less like you were living inside a mould tunnel. And in particularly soggy areas, you might even see stone lining. Walls built from flat stones stacked without mortar, angled slightly inward and wedged tightly to keep out water. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In some cases you'll find that only the lower half of the wall was stone-lined, while the upper half remained packed earth. Why waste precious materials if the lower part is where all the wetness attacks? Then there's the floor, which presented its own set of problems. Left as bare earth, it turned to muck within days. That's why many dugouts featured raised wooden slats or pallets, giving people a dry surface to sleep and walk on, while moisture gathered harmlessly below. Some even dug shallow sumps beneath the floors, mini reservoirs that collected the worst of the seepage so the rest of the room could stay dry. These sumps had to be emptied manually, of course, usually with a bowl or a ladle. Yet another lovely medieval chore, water bucket duty, featuring mould, insects, and the ever-present risk of stepping in something squishy at 3 a.m. One particularly impressive dugout system found in central Turkey had stone-lined channels running underneath the sleeping area, complete with catch basins and a rudimentary filtering system made of sand and charcoal. While that might sound like overkill for medieval Europe, it does raise the question, how much knowledge crossed cultural lines back then? Could a traveller or refugee have brought ideas with them from far-off places, sharing tricks of underground survival that spread from region to region, one muddy footprint at a time, and let's not ignore the roof. Sure, you're underground, but most dugouts had at least part of their ceiling exposed or covered only by a thin layer of soil and brush. Rain could and did seep through if that layer wasn't properly sealed. So what did they use? In drier climates, overlapping turf blocks, squares of grass and soil cut from nearby fields, were laid down like shingles. In wetter places, bundles of reeds or bark might be woven into mats and pressed into place to keep out moisture. It wasn't perfect, but it made the difference between damp and dripping. Still, even the best waterproofing failed sometimes, and when it did, you didn't panic, you adapted. Sleeping mats were elevated, food storage was moved to hanging baskets or niches carved high into the walls. Blankets were made of waxed cloth or animal hide, better at resisting water than your average sackcloth tunic. Everything was designed with damp in mind. You didn't try to beat it. You tried to stay one damp step ahead. There are still arguments among archaeologists about how effective these waterproofing methods really were. Some say most dugouts were short-term shelters at best, good for a week, maybe a season, before the mould and mildew took over. Others argue that with regular maintenance, patching clay, refreshing trenches, emptying sumps, people could live in them comfortably for months. Evidence from some of the better preserved sites suggests they weren't just shelters, but homes, complete with storage, cooking pits, and living areas that wouldn't be possible in a swampy mess. And then there are the weirder findings, like a chamber in northern Poland with crushed eggshells mixed into the floor clay. Was it symbolic? Superstitious? Or did someone figure out that calcium made the floor more durable and resistant to water? No one knows. But the idea that medieval people were experimenting with whatever they had on hand to improve their underground conditions, that's both relatable and slightly brilliant. So here you are, tucked into your cleverly dug, surprisingly dry earthen home. The air's fresh, the walls are holding, and your floor is, well, not dry, exactly, but at least not soup. Every little measure, every makeshift trench, every handful of clay smeared into a crack is a tiny rebellion against the elements. Because even underground, the world wants in. And if you're going to stay safe, warm and dry, you have to be just a little smarter than the mud that's always waiting to swallow you. So now you're inside your dugout and it's not collapsing, flooding or suffocating you. Well done. You've mastered the underground basics. But let's be honest, no matter how clever your drainage ditch is, or how well you've hidden your chimney vent under a patch of moss, you're still living inside a hole, a glorified dirt hole. And even the most determined medieval hermit didn't want to sleep face first in soil, night after night, so eventually someone somewhere said, "Okay, let's make this place feel less like a grave and more like a home." And just like that, dugout interiors started getting a little fancy, or, well, as fancy as you can get with sticks, stones and animal fat. The first order of business? Making sure the walls don't fall in on you. Packed earth is only stable to a point, especially when it rains or freezes or you sneeze too hard near a corner, so people got crafty with reinforcement. The most common method was timber lining. That meant hauling in long, straight tree limbs, usually alder, oak or whatever was available, and placing them vertically along the walls like ribs. Then horizontal beams were fitted across, creating a kind of wooden skeleton that held the shape of the chamber and gave it that extra, "please don't crush me in my sleep" stability. Some dugouts took it a step further. In certain regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, builders used the cribbing method, stacking logs in a square or rectangular pattern like giant Lincoln logs, then packing the gaps with moss, clay or wattle. This technique wasn't just strong, it made the space feel more permanent, more house-like. These interiors looked less like caves and more like rustic cabins swallowed by the earth. You can almost imagine the soft glow of a lamp flickering against those wooden walls, casting long shadows while someone stirred a pot of whatever passed for stew that day. And here's a fun little surprise. Some dugouts even had plastered walls. Not full Venetian marble, obviously, but a mixture of lime, sand and ash spread over the packed earth to smooth the surface and help reflect light. In a space where you're fighting darkness 24/7, anything that makes it feel a bit brighter is basically gold. Archaeologists have found sections of this crude plaster still clinging to walls centuries later. Hardened and cracked, but undeniably intentional. That's not the work of someone just trying to survive. That's the work of someone trying to make a life. The floors too got special treatment. If you had the means, or strong knees, you laid down wooden planks. These were typically raised slightly on stones or short logs to prevent direct contact with the damp earth. If wood was scarce, some opted for a layer of crushed stone, gravel, or even packed ash. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept the floor from turning to soup every time it rained. In one dugout uncovered in the Baltic region, researchers found a floor made of flattened bark, laid in overlapping sheets like shingles. Practical? Extremely. Slippery? Probably. But hey, your feet stayed dry. Storage came next. You can't live underground without a place to stash your things, especially when your kitchen, bedroom, and everything else are all the same 8-foot wide space. So people carved niches into the walls, little pockets where tools, food, or religious icons could be tucked safely out of the way. These niches varied from small hand-sized depressions to larger shelves big enough to hold clay pots or bundles of herbs. Some had wooden inserts, others were just bare, scooped earth. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of wall-mounted IKEA units, minus the Allen wrench. Larger dugouts might even have had separate chambers, not entirely walled off, but partitioned by hanging cloth, stacked crates, or low dividing walls made of stone and timber. You'd have your sleeping area in one corner, your fire pit in another, and maybe a tiny storage room or hidey hole for valuables, assuming you had any. In some rare cases, side tunnels led to other chambers, forming an underground mini-compound of sorts. These weren't common, but when they existed, they were usually tied to wealthier families or secretive religious orders who needed more than one room and weren't too concerned about how many calories it took to dig them. Now let's talk about beds, because yes, people actually slept down here, and not just curled on the floor like tired raccoons. If you were lucky, you had a raised sleeping platform made from logs or thick boards, covered with straw, cloth, or furs. The elevation helped keep you off the damp floor and away from crawling insects. In colder climates, the sleeping area might even be positioned near the fire pit or along the back wall, where heat collected most. And if you were really clever, or paranoid, you built your bed on top of a concealed storage compartment, one that could hide supplies, valuables, or even a person if needed. Medieval hide-and-seek was no joke. One strange but brilliant design found in a Belarusian dugout involved sunken footwells. These were shallow depressions in front of the sleeping and sitting areas, allowing people to sit comfortably with their legs hanging slightly down while the rest of their body stayed elevated and warm, like a dirt-built ergonomic lounge chair. Whoever carved that knew what comfort was, or at least had very sore knees. Lighting, of course, was essential. Even with a well-planned airshaft, it's pitch black down there most of the time. People used tallow lamps, small clay or metal bowls filled with rendered animal fat, and a bit of cloth for a wick. These gave off a smoky, greasy light, and the smell? Let's just say it was memorable. Some dugouts had reflective surfaces installed, polished metal or whitewashed walls to bounce that tiny bit of light farther into the room. It wasn't bright, but it was better than nothing. And if you didn't mind a bit of spiritual flair, candles placed near religious symbols were both decorative and, well, insurance. Even the ceilings got some attention. Low enough to trap warmth, but not so low you knocked your head every time you stood, these ceilings were sometimes reinforced with curved beams to create a slight arch, helping with structural support and condensation runoff. And, yes, there was condensation. You're breathing in a hole. Moisture happens. But smart builders made sure it happened where it wouldn't drip on your face while you slept. Historians still argue over whether these interior features were added during the initial dig or slowly improved over time. Some think most dugouts started bare bones and were upgraded once it was clear the space would be used long term. Others believe the builders had a clear plan from the start, especially in regions where dugouts were common and people passed down building knowledge like family recipes. Either way, it's clear that these weren't just holes in the ground. They were homes, built with intention, care, and a quiet kind of pride. So now you sit back on your creaky wooden bed frame, tallow lamp sputtering softly, the faint scent of clay and charred wood in the air. The walls are solid, the floor's dry, your tools are tucked into their little niche, and above you a timber beam groans gently with the weight of the world. But in here, you've carved out something that's yours. Cramped, sure, but safe. And that, in the medieval world, made all the difference. At this point, you've got yourself a pretty solid setup, literally. Reinforced walls, a dry floor, and enough ventilation to avoid an early death by smoke inhalation. It's not luxurious, but it's livable. Still, for a certain type of medieval builder, livable wasn't enough. Some looked around their single, cramped room and thought, you know what would be nice? A second floor. Or at least another room. Because even when you're hiding underground from invaders, famine, or just bad weather, there's something innately human about wanting a little extra space. And thus, the brave few attempted the bold move of going multi-level. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about lavish underground mansions with spiral staircases and ensuite latrines, but we're talking about vertical ambition. Some medieval dugouts weren't just one single chamber. They were complex, multi-tiered hideaways with steps, platforms, and even branching rooms. Why? Well, for one, it helped with storage. If you could dig a few extra feet down or up, you gained a cool, dry pantry. If you widened a wall just enough to tuck in another chamber, you could separate sleeping quarters from work or worship space. Practicality was the name of the game. So how did they do it without collapsing the entire thing on themselves? Carefully. Very carefully. Multi-level dugouts relied on solid soil types. Again, loose or compact clay, and meticulous engineering. Floors were sometimes cut directly into the slope, forming terraced levels that naturally followed the shape of the hill. In other designs, loft-like platforms were built into the walls using beams set deep into carved sockets, creating upper sleeping or storage areas above the main floor. These were accessible via simple ladders or notched logs, basically medieval bunk beds, but with higher stakes. One fascinating find from southern Russia revealed a dugout with 3 vertical levels. The lowest appeared to be for food storage, cooler, damper and sealed from light. The middle chamber served as the living space, with a fire pit, wall niches, and some scattered domestic items like spoons and thread spindles. The topmost area, a cramped little crawl space with burn marks on the ceiling. Most archaeologists believe it was a ventilation or smoke channel, but there's still a camp that thinks it might have been used as a lookout, or even a panic nook, the medieval version of hiding in the attic when things go south. And sometimes, the levels weren't stacked but linked sideways. A main room might have narrow side tunnels branching off into auxiliary spaces, one for storage, another for tools, another, if the builders were feeling bold, for livestock. That's right. Some dugouts included animal pens. Now before you judge, remember that during a siege your goat wasn't just a pet. It was warmth, milk, and in a pinch, dinner. A side chamber for a goat, sealed and ventilated separately, was the difference between survival and starvation. You might think sharing a hole with livestock is extreme, but let's be real. You've definitely endured worse seating arrangements on a budget airline. The stairs, or rather steps carved into the earth, were usually steep, narrow, and designed more for function than grace. Some were reinforced with flat stones or wooden planks, while others were simply worn into the packed soil by repeated use. And like everything underground, they had to be carved with an understanding of weight, slope, and gravity. Too shallow and you'd trip. Too steep and you'd slip right into the goat chamber. Some clever dugout dwellers even used elevation as a defensive feature. Think about it. If your main chamber was sunken, and the entrance led slightly uphill, it was harder for someone to attack directly. You'd hear them coming. You could block the passage from below. It's the underground version of holding the high ground, except in reverse. In a few cases, archaeologists found vertical shafts disguised from above, leading down into sealed chambers with no obvious entrance from the front. These were likely emergency-only hideaways, accessible via rope ladders, and designed to be sealed once you were inside. Kind of like going into hibernation with your whole family. But what about those long, mysterious corridors you sometimes hear about in local legends? You know the ones. Tunnels stretching for miles between castles and chapels, or from a monastery to a forest clearing. Did those really exist? Well, sometimes. But not in the way movies want you to believe. While a few longer tunnels have been discovered, some over 100 metres long, they weren't luxury underground highways. They were low, narrow, damp and terrifying. Think crawling on your stomach in the pitch dark with half a loaf of bread and no promise of light at the end. These weren't built for comfort. They were built for escape, for when everything else failed. Some of these longer tunnels connected multi-room dugout complexes, creating the closest thing medieval people had to a bunker system. Others led from a main dugout to a secondary emergency exit, carefully concealed and only known to a few. These escape routes often sloped subtly upward to allow easier movement out than in. You could grab a pack, climb to freedom, and vanish into the woods, assuming you remembered the way. Because yes, people did get lost in their own tunnels. It happened. Hence the occasional use of carved symbols or notches along the walls, guiding the way in and out like a primitive GPS. Turn left at the deer antler. If you hit the dead rat, you've gone too far. A few sites in Scandinavia suggest that entire families lived underground in these multi-room setups for extended periods. One even had evidence of a common room, a larger central chamber with offshoots leading to individual cells, almost like an underground village square. Whether it was a semi-permanent settlement or just a complex shelter is still up for debate, but the layout hints at social organisation, maybe even hierarchy. The nicer rooms were farther from the entrance, better ventilated, and had more elaborate finishing. Some things never change. Prime real estate is always in demand, even under a hill. And then there's the issue of maintenance. Multi-level dugouts weren't a one-and-done project. They had to be maintained constantly, recutting steps, reinforcing beams, patching up leaks, and clearing out tunnel blockages. It was like living inside a project that never quite got finished, which honestly sounds very on-brand for the medieval lifestyle. Start digging a multi-room, goat-friendly earth bunker to survive a war, get halfway done, and then find out peace broke out or the goats ate your floor. But when it worked, it worked. These expanded dugouts weren't just survival pits, they were ecosystems, microworlds carved by hand and held together with mud, muscle, and sheer determination. You weren't just hiding, you were living, cooking, sleeping, praying, maybe even laughing, though softly of course, can't let the neighbours hear you. So now imagine climbing the narrow steps from your sleeping chamber to the storage nook, grabbing a bundle of dried herbs, and heading back down, your feet bare, your lamp warm in your hand. The air is still, the walls don't echo, and above you, the world goes on, unaware that below, life is thriving in the dark, one careful, quiet step at a time. So you've got this multi-level earth bunker going, complete with stairs, storage rooms, and maybe even a goat or two tucked into a side chamber. Very on trend for the 11th century. But once you're sealed up inside with your family, your livestock, your dwindling supply of root, vegetables, and the crushing weight of moist silence pressing in from all sides, you start to notice a new problem. It's really, really dark. Like you close your eyes, and it's the same dark. You're living underground after all, not in some medieval spa retreat. The sun doesn't visit here. Light, real light, is a rare and precious thing, and producing it without alerting the entire countryside is a balancing act of genius and paranoia. So how exactly did medieval people light these hidden spaces? It's not like you can crack a window or hang a lantern in the front yard. And while fire is great for warmth and drama, it's also a red flag. The smoke, the glow, it's the kind of thing that says, "Hi, yes, there are people hiding here. Please bring torches and swords." So they had to get creative, subtle, and sometimes downright weird. The most common solution was the humble tallow lamp, a shallow bowl or stone depression filled with rendered animal fat, with a bit of twisted cloth or moss acting as a wick. Not exactly the romantic candlelight of period dramas. It sputtered, it smoked, and it smelled somewhere between wet dog and a butcher's shop. But it worked. You'd light one and get just enough illumination to see where your foot was going. You wanted more light. Too bad. This was a one lamp per room kind of lifestyle. In wealthier or more prepared communities, oil lamps might be used, especially in regions that had access to vegetable or nut oils. These burned cleaner and longer than tallow, but oil was a luxury. If you were hiding from raiders or religious persecution, chances are you weren't pouring out your best walnut oil to read by. Still, fragments of ceramic oil lamps have been found in some well-built dugouts, sometimes with soot marks on the walls above them, their edges blackened and chipped from years of use. It's one of those little human details that sticks with you. Someone sat there in that gloom, feeding the flame, watching it dance across a bare wall, listening for danger in the silence. But light was dangerous. Too much, and it risked exposure. That's why some builders installed light slits, tiny horizontal openings in the upper parts of the dugout, hidden under overhangs or within tree roots. During the day, these allowed a faint trickle of natural light inside without betraying the dugout's location. Slits were often angled to minimise the chance of someone spotting the glow from the outside. They weren't bright, and they weren't all that helpful, but when you've been underground for days, even the weakest shaft of sunlight can feel like a divine gift. There were also attempts to bounce light using reflective surfaces. In a few exceptional sites, archaeologists found fragments of polished metal or even shiny stone set into walls at strategic points. Was it to reflect lamplight? Possibly. Maybe just a decorative touch. Or maybe someone figured out that placing a shiny dish opposite a light source doubled the effectiveness of a single flame. Primitive physics meets desperate interior design. It's debatable how well it worked, but it shows how badly people wanted just a little more brightness in their lives. In larger dugouts, especially those used for longer stays, builders sometimes created dedicated light wells, vertical shafts open to the surface, positioned to catch sunlight during certain parts of the day. These were often disguised at ground level with piles of brush or clever stonework to keep them hidden. Some even had removable covers, bits of turf or bark that could be pulled away to let light in and then replaced to hide the opening. It wasn't elegant, and the angle had to be just right to avoid turning the well into a rain funnel, but the concept was sound. A little light went a long way. Of course, all of this assumes that light was actually wanted. There's some debate, ongoing and surprisingly passionate among historians, about whether total darkness was sometimes preferred. In ritual chambers, or dugouts used by secret religious sects or outlawed communities, darkness may have been part of the experience. Some theories even suggest that intentionally lightless spaces were used for sensory deprivation, meditation, or initiation ceremonies. There's no hard proof, but in at least one site in Central Europe, archaeologists found a side chamber with no obvious light source, no soot marks, and no evidence of occupancy, except for a single carved spiral in the wall. Its purpose? Unclear. But definitely weird. Maybe sacred. Maybe just someone going slowly insane. And then there's the weirdest theory of all, glow fungi. In extremely rare and damp environments, certain species of bioluminescent fungi can give off a faint green glow. There are some fringe researchers who believe that medieval people might have harnessed these glowing fungi, either intentionally or accidentally, to create low-level light in dugouts. Is it likely? Not really. Is it possible? Just enough to make you want to believe it. Picture it. A chamber glowing gently with ghost green light. The walls alive with moisture and mycelium, no flame needed. If nothing else, it would make for an unforgettable bedtime story. But the truth is, most lighting came down to a dance between practicality and secrecy. Fire was always a risk, not just of smoke inhalation or burning down your only shelter, but of being seen. So every flame had to be low, shielded, and brief. People learned to move by touch, to memorize the layout of their shelter, to live in a permanent state of half-shadow. Your eyes adjusted, your movements slowed. You didn't fumble, because fumbling meant knocking over a lamp and waking up in a pile of smouldering straw and panic. Still, there's something strangely peaceful about it. Imagine sitting in your dugout, the flame of a single lamp flickering against the earth walls. Everything is hushed. The dirt absorbs sound. The outside world, full of shouting and clanging and fire, feels impossibly far away. Inside, it's just you, the low breath of a hidden fire, and shadows that no one else can see. You're not just in the dark. You've made peace with it. And that, in a way, was the point. The dugout wasn't just protection. It was separation. A little world carved away from all the madness above, lit softly, lived in quietly, hidden not just by soil, but by silence, stillness, and just enough light to remind you that yes, you're still alive. You've got light now, faint, flickering and slightly greasy smelling, but enough to keep you from tripping over your own foot in the dark. But light alone won't keep your teeth from chattering. Let's be honest, the ground might insulate you from the wind, but it doesn't exactly radiate warmth, especially in the winter months when the surface world freezes solid and the chill seeps downward like a ghost looking for bones to haunt. So how did medieval people heat their underground hideouts without turning them into ovens or smoke chambers? That's the next survival puzzle, and it's a tricky one. Fire naturally was the first and most obvious answer. But in a sealed underground space, building a fire is basically playing a slow-motion game of how long until I pass out from carbon monoxide. The same warm, cheerful blaze that kept your fingers from falling off could just as easily suffocate you while you slept. So people had to find ways to use fire without being used up by it. This meant small flames, constant airflow, and an almost obsessive attention to smoke direction. The most common heating solution was a sunken fire pit, a shallow depression dug into the floor of the main chamber, usually in the centre or along a wall. Fires were kept small and fed sparingly, not just to conserve fuel, but to keep smoke levels manageable. Wood was the usual go-to, but in regions where it was scarce, people burned peat, dried dung, or even bundles of tightly twisted straw. Whatever they could find that would smoulder rather than roar. To deal with the smoke, many dugouts had low-angled chimney shafts, leading upward and out through a carefully concealed exit. These weren't chimneys in the modern sense, no bricks or copper cowls, just a narrow tunnel lined with clay or stone, angled just enough to create a draft without letting rain pour in. Often, the chimney exit was hidden under a pile of leaves, or disguised within a rock crevice, allowing smoke to drift upward in wisps that blended with morning mist. And if someone was watching, you hoped they mistook it for a cooking fire from a nearby shepherd's camp, or didn't see it at all. Still, burning anything underground was risky. Fires had to be monitored constantly, and ventilation had to be balanced like a medieval chemistry equation. Some builders created double shaft systems, one for pulling in fresh air, another for venting smoke. These shafts were often placed at opposite ends of the dugout, allowing air to circulate naturally. A few had primitive dampers, movable stones or panels that could be adjusted to redirect airflow. In one particularly ingenious example found in a Romanian dugout, archaeologists discovered a carved vent system that used the slope of the hill and prevailing winds to pull smoke upward like a vacuum. It was essentially a chimney designed by instinct and trial and error, but it worked. But sometimes, the smartest move was to avoid fire inside the dugout altogether. In colder climates, families developed an alternative method, the heated stone trick. You'd build a fire outside, or in a small side chamber if weather or secrecy required it, and once the stones were glowing hot, you'd carry them into the main chamber using tongs or wooden sleds. The heat from these stones would slowly radiate for hours, warming the space without smoke or flame. Think of it as a medieval radiator minus the safety features. It wasn't perfect, you could definitely burn yourself, but it made the difference between frostbite and functioning fingers. Another method, especially in long-term hideouts or religious shelters, was the hypocaust-style floor, a concept borrowed from Roman engineering. While it was rare and mostly found in places with Roman influence, the basic idea involved a raised floor supported by stones or logs, beneath which hot air from a fire could circulate. The heat rose, warming the floor and the chamber above. It was complicated, fuel-hungry and maintenance-heavy, but in some cases it was worth the effort. Whether the idea survived through tradition, or was reinvented from scratch, it speaks to the resourcefulness of people who weren't willing to shiver in silence forever. Of course, fire wasn't the only source of heat. Body warmth mattered. A lot. Families would huddle together under layers of wool, furs, and woven mats. Dogs, goats, even chickens were often kept inside during the coldest nights, not out of affection, but because every heartbeat added heat. One traveller from the Baltic region wrote of entering a dugout and finding it warmer within than the frostbound forest without by breath and beast alike. Charming, and probably a little smelly. To retain that hard-earned warmth, the structure itself had to help. Dugouts were often rounded or domed on the inside, not just for strength, but for thermal efficiency. The curved shape reduced corners where cold air could gather and helped circulate heat more evenly. Openings were kept small and covered tightly when not in use. Thick layers of moss, turf or straw were packed above the ceiling to trap warmth. Floors were layered with animal hides or cloth scraps to insulate against the cold dirt. Even simple things, like placing your bedding on a raised platform rather than directly on the ground, made a huge difference in warmth and survival. There's a curious ongoing debate among scholars about how much emphasis was placed on comfort versus pure survival. Were these heating methods designed just to avoid death? Or did people genuinely try to create cosy spaces in their earthen shelters? Evidence of personal touches, like carved decorative panels near fire pits or smooth stones arranged into hearth shapes, suggests the latter. Even in hiding, people wanted warmth that felt like home, not just heat that kept their skin from freezing. There's also that odd little anecdote from 13th century Wales, where a woman supposedly brewed medicinal teas inside a dugout by placing clay cups next to heated stones rather than boiling them over flame. Not only is this smart in a confined space, but it's weirdly cosy. There's just something heartening about the idea of someone crouched underground, stirring herbs in silence, chasing comfort in the middle of a crisis. Of course, not everyone got it right. Some dugouts were found with telltale scorch marks, collapsed ceilings from chimney failure, or charcoal layers so thick it's assumed the residents either died of smoke inhalation or had to flee, leaving their hard work behind. Like everything in the medieval world, heating your secret bunker came with risk. But when it worked, it meant life. And more than life, it meant dignity. It meant eating warm food, sleeping without shaking, and waking up without frost on your eyebrows. So now picture it. You're sitting close to the stone hearth, wrapped in a fur, your breath no longer misting in front of your face. Outside, the snow falls in silence, covering your hidden home in a thick white blanket. Inside, your stones glow faintly, your lamp flickers low, and the cold no longer claws at your skin. You're not just surviving, you're warm, underground, and invisible to the world that's trying to freeze you out. Warmth? Check. Air? Check. Structures holding steady. For now, at least. You've made it through the hardest parts of building your medieval hideaway. But now comes the part no one likes to think about, and yet everyone has to deal with eventually. Actually living down here. Day in, day out. You're underground. You've got maybe 2 or 3 rooms carved into soil, a couple of tallow lamps, and a fire pit that eats through your wood faster than you'd like. But this isn't a weekend retreat anymore. It's your home, your hideout, maybe even your whole world for the foreseeable future. So, what does life actually look like in an underground dugout? First of all, let's talk about the smell. There's no gentle way to say this. It's a little funky. The walls are dirt, the floor is either damp or layered with rotting straw, or worse, the things that used to be straw. Add a few bodies, a goat, a couple of wet boots, and a pot of cabbage that's been simmering since yesterday, and you've got yourself a very pungent situation. You could try to air it out, sure, but ventilation shafts only do so much. People used herbs, bundles of thyme, mint, or juniper to mask the odour. These were hung from ceiling beams, tucked into bedding, or crushed into water and used as a kind of medieval Febreze. Was it effective? Not entirely, but it helped. Barely. Then there's food. If you're living underground, you're probably not harvesting fresh vegetables every morning, so your diet becomes limited. Root vegetables, dried grains, maybe some smoked fish or salted meat, if you were lucky enough to prepare in advance. Meals were simple and repetitive. Pottage, a thick stew made from whatever was left in your stores. Bread, if you had flour and a way to bake it. Sometimes just boiled grain. In the better setups, people carved out shelves or cool nooks into the earthen walls to store food. Places where temperatures stayed steady and scavengers couldn't reach. Clay jars sealed with wax helped keep things fresh. Kind of. Cooking was either done over that tiny central hearth or using hot stones dropped into pots, especially if smoke control was a concern. This method, heating stones in a fire, then transferring them into a pot of water, could cook everything from porridge to broth and produced very little smoke. But it was slow, tedious, and meant someone was always on don't let the rocks explode duty. And yes, they could explode, especially if they had moisture trapped inside. Boom. Dinner and dignity, both gone in an instant. Daily routines were, well, they weren't really routines so much as survival habits. You kept the fire going. You checked the walls for signs of collapse. You emptied the sump pit. Maybe you carved some new storage niches or widened the entry shaft if it was sagging. Someone always had to be on alert, listening for sounds from above. Footsteps, hooves, unfamiliar voices. That job usually went to whoever had the best hearing or the least patience. In some cases, there was a literal listening hole, A small tunnel near the surface with a thin break at the top that allowed outside noise to filter in. Just enough to catch the sound of rain or maybe a passing patrol, not enough to be obvious. Sleeping arrangements were tight. If you were lucky, you had a platform or cot. More often, you just rolled up in a blanket on whatever straw was available. Families slept in shifts, depending on how much space they had. Children often curled together, dogs and goats included, while the adults took turns sitting watch. Night and day blurred in the underground. Without natural light, you had to rely on gut instinct or someone tracking time by how often the tallow needed refilling. Some dugouts even scratched markings on the wall to keep track of days, small notches or lines like a calendar carved by candlelight. Archaeologists have found these in multiple locations, some stretching for hundreds of days. That's not just hiding, that's living. As for hygiene, let's just say it was not glamorous. People either dug waste pits in a side chamber, or used chamber pots emptied outside under cover of darkness. In larger dugouts, waste might be funneled through a narrow side tunnel, leading to a concealed outlet further down the slope. But most of the time, it was a miserable, smelly compromise between privacy and necessity. And if you got sick down here, well, you hoped it wasn't serious. With no sunlight and poor airflow, infection spread fast, and you couldn't exactly call for a physician without blowing your cover. Some hideouts kept dried herbs and poultices on hand. Nettle, willow bark and crushed garlic were favourites. But they weren't miracle cures. A sore throat could turn serious fast, especially if you were sharing your air with a half-dozen other people in an unventilated chamber. And yet, somehow, people made space for ritual and routine. Even in hiding, people prayed. Shrines were carved into the walls, simple alcoves with a wooden cross or a tiny icon. In one English dugout, likely used by outlawed clergy, a full wall was dedicated to religious etchings, crude Latin phrases, handprints, and a sketch of a saint that looked eerily serene given the circumstances. Light was kept near these alcoves, often protected by little shields of glass or horn, so the flame wouldn't flicker too much. It was the medieval version of sanctuary lighting. You didn't have a church bell, but you had this, a quiet glow in the dark telling you to keep going. There's an open debate among scholars about whether people chose to stay in these underground homes long term, or were simply trapped by circumstances. Some argue that dugouts were always meant to be temporary, crisis shelters to wait out danger. But others point to evidence of extended occupation. Soot layers several inches thick, stone tools worn smooth from daily use, even carved decorations that clearly weren't done in a hurry. These weren't just emergency holes. For some, they were homes, unorthodox, hidden, and built out of sheer stubbornness. And then there's the matter of sound. You might think it would be silent underground, but it wasn't. Not completely. You could hear the slow creak of wooden supports settling, the distant trickle of water through a drain trench, the crackle of the fire, and if you were really quiet, the occasional rustle of life from above, a bird, a cartwheel, or something much worse. These noises became part of your life. You learned which ones meant safety, and which ones meant it was time to clutch your blanket and hold your breath. Despite the hardship, there are records, rare but real, of people remembering their time underground as oddly peaceful. One monk, writing decades after the persecution of his order, described the quiet of earth above and below as a kind of forced meditation. He said that while he feared for his life every day, he also found a stillness that neither sword nor sermon could break. Strange to think that a space carved in fear could also become a place of reflection. But maybe that's just what happens when you strip life down to its barest essentials: warmth, air, food, light, and silence. So now picture yourself there, curled under a rough wool blanket, your back against a clay wall that someone's hands shaped a generation ago. You've eaten your pottage, you've marked the day. There's a flame flickering in the niche beside your head, and the earth around you hums with quiet life. No shouting, no war horns, no cold wind. Just the close, muffled hush of the world beneath the world. It's not comfortable, but it's yours. And in the Middle Ages, that counted for everything. You're deep into this underground life now. Your body's adjusted to the smells, your eyes to the dimness, and your ears to the quiet, hollow echo of a chamber that wants to stay secret. But for all the careful planning, the stone-lined floors, the hidden fire pits, and your stack of increasingly questionable root vegetables, one question still looms over your dirt-packed ceiling. What happens if someone finds you? Because for all its charm, this dugout isn't a fortress. And whether you're hiding from a raid, a band of bounty hunters, or a pack of armed tax collectors who've decided you look a little too poor to be honest, you need a way out that doesn't involve politely using the front door. That's where emergency exits come in. Those narrow, barely breathable escape routes carved into the earth like lifelines, hidden in plain sight and known only to the desperate. These weren't luxury features. They were last-ditch, cold sweat, don't-look-back solutions for when everything else went wrong. And building one was a special kind of art. Let's say your dugout's original entrance is cleverly hidden under a pile of brush. Great. But once it's discovered, if someone notices the trampled moss or smells smoke from your cleverly disguised vent, it becomes a death trap. There's no back door, no second floor to leap from. Just you, your family, and a 6-foot thick layer of dirt above your head. So the emergency exit needed to be both hidden and usable, and that's where the design started to get creative. One common trick was the buried vertical shaft. This was dug from inside the chamber upward, at a steep angle or even straight up, leading to a concealed surface point like a tree stump, hollow log, or a rock outcrop. These shafts were often plugged with a removable patch of soil and turf, reinforced with a piece of wood or a flat stone. From the outside, it just looked like the rest of the forest floor. From the inside, if you knew where to push, it could pop open, assuming the ground wasn't frozen, flooded, or blocked by a badger, a surprisingly common and deeply inconvenient issue. These shafts were narrow, barely big enough to squeeze through. You didn't climb them gracefully, you crawled, you scrambled, you shoved your shoulders upward and tried not to panic when your foot caught a root. They were just wide enough to serve their purpose, let one person escape and lead others out in a line. Sometimes footholds were carved into the walls, like a ladder made of desperation. In one example found in the Carpathians, there were even looped ropes made from twisted animal sinew still faintly clinging to the shaft wall centuries later. That rope, in its day, might have saved lives, or snapped at just the wrong moment. Either way, it was there. Other escape routes were horizontal tunnels, dug out from the back or side of the main chamber and sloping gently upward to an exit point concealed in the undergrowth or behind a stone wall. These were harder to dig, longer, riskier, more prone to collapse, but easier to crawl through, especially for children or the elderly. Some were built with trapdoors that opened into abandoned wells or dry riverbeds, using natural features to disguise the exit. In a few cases, the emergency route was a tunnel leading directly to a neighbour's cellar or another nearby dugout, forming an underground network of shared escape paths. You didn't just flee alone, you brought your neighbours with you, or at least warned them with a coded knock on the tunnel wall. And these weren't just for human use. If you had animals, even just a couple of chickens or that stubborn goat, you needed a way to get them out too. A few emergency tunnels were built wider than the rest of the dugout, clearly designed with livestock in mind. One Polish site had grooves in the floor consistent with dragging a small cart, or more likely a sled, loaded with supplies, or a child too young to walk the tunnel. It's a strange and powerful image, a family on the move in total silence, pulling their life behind them on a wooden plank, every heartbeat louder than their footsteps. The entrances to these emergency tunnels were just as carefully hidden as the main one, often more so. Some were concealed behind a false wall, a few inches of soil and wattle plastered over a narrow opening that could be broken through in a hurry. Others were sealed with removable stones, fitted so precisely you'd never guess they weren't part of the chamber's original structure. In one particularly eerie case found in Estonia, the remains of such a tunnel were discovered completely collapsed, with nothing but a single boot and a crushed wooden torch near its entrance. No one knows whether the occupant got out or not, but they clearly tried. There's a debate, still ongoing, about how many dugouts actually had these features. Some archaeologists argue that emergency exits were rare, built only by the most experienced or paranoid. Others believe they were standard, just poorly preserved or overlooked. Many of the materials used, wood, bark, rope, don't survive centuries underground, and when tunnels collapse, they often vanish completely. So how many families thought ahead? carved their second path to safety, and used it just once, just in time? We may never know. Still, the knowledge had to come from somewhere. In certain regions, like parts of Ukraine and Western Russia, escape tunnel construction was passed down as part of oral tradition. Elders taught the best angles to dig, how to reinforce a shaft with reeds or brush, and how to disguise the exit so that even a seasoned tracker would walk right past it. In communities living under constant threat of invasion, persecution, or forced conscription, knowing how to vanish underground and how to get back out again wasn't a luxury, it was common sense. One surprisingly elegant method found in a few hill-dug shelters used air pressure as a detection system. A thin feather or strand of hair hung near the emergency tunnel entrance would flutter if someone opened the outer exit, allowing air to rush through. It was a way to tell, without making noise, whether the path was still clear. And if it moved when no one had touched it, well, that's when you blew out the lamp and got ready to run. There's something intimate about the idea of carving your own escape route, inch by inch, knowing that you might never need it, and also that it might be the only thing that saves you. These tunnels weren't built in fear, they were built in hope. The hope that you'd have one more chance, one more move, one more exit. Because if the worst happened, and it often did, you weren't going down without a plan. So imagine this. You hear the first shouts from above, the unmistakable clatter of boots on frost-crusted ground, a barked command in a language you don't understand. You've practiced this. You grab your pack, your child, your knife. You press your hand to the false wall, feel the loose earth give way, and crawl into the black, narrow passage. Behind you, the world tightens. Ahead, the air smells faintly of moss and freedom. You don't look back. You just move forward, inch by inch, following the path only you know is there. You've escaped once or twice now, maybe just in drills, maybe for real. Either way, you know how it feels. Heart hammering, knees raw, one hand gripping a satchel full of hard bread, and the other reaching forward into blind dirt, hoping the next breath is outside air. But what if there is no escape? What if this dugout isn't just a hideaway but your final fallback? Because in war, real medieval, scorched earth war, sometimes the dugout wasn't just shelter, it was the last stand. And when that happened, these little holes in the ground became makeshift bunkers, built not just for survival, but for defence. Medieval warfare wasn't all clashing swords and slow-motion jousting. It was mostly burning, raiding, screaming. Villages were torched, crops trampled, livestock slaughtered, and in places where borders shifted more than the wind, war could roll through your village a dozen times in a generation. So what did people do? They didn't build castles, they didn't have the money. Instead, they built dugouts with teeth. Not to fight from, but to not die in. These defensive dugouts took everything we've talked about so far, disguise, ventilation, water management, and layered on a grim, war-hardened logic. First, they were often dug deeper, tucked into denser terrain like wooded hills or cliff bases, where smoke could vanish into the trees and sound didn't carry as far. Access was tighter. Entrances were sometimes booby-trapped or collapsed deliberately once everyone was inside, not out of paranoia, out of strategy. One chilling example found in southern Bohemia's had two separate collapsible entrances, each with a locking mechanism made of interlaced branches and a clay release plug. Once activated from the inside, dirt would fall in and seal the opening behind them. That's not something you build lightly. That's something you build when you expect someone to come looking, and to come with torches. Inside, these war dugouts were compact and efficient. Sleeping space? Minimal. Storage? Maximised. There'd be hidden caches of weapons, spears, short swords, even bows, stored in narrow side slots, and while you're probably not shooting arrows from a dirt tunnel, they weren't necessarily meant for open battle. They were meant for ambush, for what happened if someone breached the dugout, if the door came open and your whole family was cornered. No one wanted to fight inside a chamber with 3 feet of headroom and no exits. But people prepared for it anyway. Some of these bunkers were connected to each other through low crawl spaces, allowing groups to shift position unseen. If one entrance was breached, you could move to another chamber. In one particularly striking case, a network of 6 dugouts was found linked under a single hillside. each with its own fire pit, its own water catchment trench, and its own escape route. Were they used by a village, a resistance group? No one knows. But there were soot layers in every chamber, shattered pottery, blunted blades. These places were used, and they weren't just defensive in layout, they were fortified by knowledge. Locals knew the terrain. They picked hiding spots near natural choke points, like ravines, cliffs, and narrow passes, where any approaching force would have to slow down. In these spots you could slip underground and vanish while the enemy stomped past above you, none the wiser. And if they did find you? Well, the dugout might not save you, but it could buy you time, or at the very least, deny the enemy the satisfaction of easy prey. There are even records of dugouts being used as temporary strongholds during uprisings. Peasant revolts, rebel priests, outlawed monks, all kinds of groups went underground when their fight moved from open defiance to survival. Some of these dugouts were reinforced with stone walls, carved arrow slits, or wooden barricades. There's debate about whether they were truly combat-ready or just symbolic defences, but either way, someone expected a fight. One case from the Germanic states tells of a small heretical group, hiding from both church and crown, who fortified their dugout with poured lime and crushed glass embedded in the tunnel walls, making any forced entry a crawl through a jagged, flesh-ripping nightmare. That's not just survival engineering, that's vengeance built into the walls, the kind of thing you do when you're absolutely done playing fair. But for all that, these weren't fortresses in the traditional sense. They couldn't withstand a siege. They didn't have towers or battlements. They were more like traps for time, places meant to hold you just long enough for the storm to pass, a last shelter, a final defiance. Some were designed to collapse completely. You'd hide everyone inside, then trigger a cave-in from a side tunnel, sealing yourselves in with enough air and supplies to last a few days. The idea? If they couldn't find you, they'd leave. Or if they found the entrance, it would look like a burial site, not a living chamber. Risky? Of course, but so was every minute spent breathing in the open, and not all resistance was physical. Some of the most dangerous acts of rebellion inside these wartime dugouts were mental. People preserved banned books here, sacred objects. In one stunning find in France, a clay-lined chamber was uncovered with hidden compartments filled with manuscript fragments, religious texts, local records, even maps. Some were wrapped in oilcloth, others had been hidden inside hollowed logs. Clearly someone wasn't just hiding people, they were hiding ideas, and in a time when information was as dangerous as steel, that made this dugout more of an archive than a bunker, a library in the dirt. There's even evidence that some of these wartime shelters were used for interrogation or resistance planning. A chamber in the Tatra Mountains had strange carvings along the walls, codes, perhaps, or instructions. Burn marks in a pattern that suggested timed torch placement. Was it a secret meeting room? A torture chamber? A training site? Scholars argue, but the feeling lingers. Something serious happened down there. Something more than just hiding. And that's the thing about these dugouts. They weren't just holes in the ground. They were symbols. You couldn't build a castle, but you could carve your defiance into the earth. You couldn't stop an army, but you could outlast it. You could vanish beneath its boots, re-emerge later, and remind the world you were still there. So now, imagine that moment. The shouting outside, the smoke creeping in through your vent, the pounding of boots drawing closer. You're crouched in the deepest chamber, a blade in your lap, your back against the wall. There's no escape this time. But your dugout was never meant to be a runway. It was meant to be resistance. And if they come for you, they'll find a fight waiting in the dark. You've made it through battle now. One way or another. Maybe your dugout held, maybe it didn't. Maybe it bought you just enough time to vanish into the forest or retreat through a tunnel barely wide enough to fit your ribs. But not every underground chamber was a desperate last stand. Some were carved with a different kind of purpose, a slower kind of survival. Not for hiding from soldiers, but for hiding from sin, for reflection, for ritual. Because in a world where faith and fear braided tightly around daily life, there were those who chose to descend into the earth not to escape, but to get closer to what they believed waited beyond it. Welcome to the other side of the dugout, the spiritual side. These weren't hideouts. These were underground sanctuaries, and in some cases they weren't just for the living. Let's start with the anchorites. You might have heard of them, religious devotees who sealed themselves inside tiny rooms, often attached to churches, to spend the rest of their lives in prayer and isolation. What you may not have heard is that some of these rooms weren't built above ground. They were dug directly into hillsides or beneath chapels, forming subterranean hermitages where light barely reached and sound from the world above became little more than a hum. Imagine choosing that. Imagine voluntarily stepping into a dugout, not for safety, but for the chance to erase yourself from the world and listen more closely for God. One such site in southern England held the remains of a small underground chamber, no larger than a cupboard, beneath a church long since crumbled. There was a ledge for sitting, a stone basin for washing, or ritual purity depending on who you ask, and a tiny opening in the ceiling that led to the floor of the church above. Through that gap the recluse could hear Mass, receive bread and water, maybe even confession. No door, no ladder, just a life walled in by faith and soil. But even outside the extreme lives of anchorites, spiritual dugouts were surprisingly common. In times of religious persecution, whether Catholic priests hiding from Protestant reformers or heretics dodging inquisitors, underground chambers became secret chapels, complete with crude altars, crosses etched into the walls, and shallow fonts for holy water. These spaces were often tucked away behind false walls or hidden through trapdoors beneath barns and homes, and while many were basic, just a chamber with some symbols, others were remarkably elaborate. In parts of Eastern Europe, particularly in Slavic lands, entire underground shrines have been discovered. Multi-chambered spaces with dome ceilings, niches for icons, and even rudimentary acoustics designed to amplify chants or readings. That's right. People who were living by firelight and eating boiled turnips somehow figured out how to carve a room in such a way that sound carried. Whether it was intentional or just a happy accident is still debated, but the effect is undeniable. If you stand in one of those chambers and whisper, the voice lingers. It reverberates, like the room is listening back. Some of these spaces weren't just sacred. They were secret initiation chambers, possibly tied to fringe religious movements or mystical sects. Carvings found in one Baltic dugout show concentric circles, star shapes, and human figures with elongated limbs and wide, staring eyes. Not standard Christian iconography, that's for sure. Theories abound. Was it a Gnostic group? Pagan holdouts masking themselves with Christian front doors? Or just one particularly imaginative monk left unsupervised for too long with a chisel? No one knows. But the symbols are deliberate, and they appear again in nearby cave systems. Clearly something was happening beneath the ground that didn't match what the churches above were preaching. And then there are the burial chambers, dugouts used not to preserve life, but to honour death. In regions where grave robbing was a risk, or during plagues when burials had to be hidden from fearful neighbours, underground tombs were carved into isolated hillsides. These weren't grand catacombs, just a room, a slab, and the body. Sometimes multiple bodies, often with crosses or runes carved into the walls. Some chambers even had guard niches, small alcoves where a family member could sit vigil. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they were there to keep watch for something else. A few of these spaces, especially those associated with pre-Christian or syncretic faiths, were designed with an eye to alignments. Openings or shafts were angled to catch moonlight during certain nights of the year, or the first beam of sunrise on the solstice. What's fascinating is that these chambers were still dug using basic tools, just hands, pickaxes, and maybe a little divine inspiration, but the precision rivals anything you'd find above ground. Whether that was symbolic, astronomical, or just someone with a lot of time on their hands and a good eye for shadows, it's hard to say. And yes, there are the rumours, the fringe stories, tales of underground rooms used for summoning, sacrifice, or darker rites. A chamber in the Caucasus, with a floor stained dark and shallow indentations like footprints, but with only 4 toes. Another in rural France, with walls scorched in handprints, each the same size, each pressed into the stone with no tool marks around them. Skeptics dismiss these as fantasy, erosion, pranks. But every once in a while, someone with a flashlight and a degree will find one and come back a little too quiet. There's a long-standing debate among scholars about how much of this spiritual use was planned versus repurposed. Did someone dig a shelter and later turn it into a shrine? Or were some of these dugouts designed as sacred spaces from the start? There's evidence both ways. But what's clear is that the underground offered something the surface didn't: privacy, protection, silence, and in a world where the church and the crown were often watching from opposite corners, having a place where your prayers were heard by no one else was sometimes the only path to peace. One of the more poetic records comes from a letter smuggled out of a persecuted village in 14th century Spain. The writer, a young man hiding with a group of outlawed monks, described his days underground not as suffering, but as living inside the womb of the world where no sword can follow and every breath feels like prayer. It's hard to read that and not feel something. These weren't just survival spaces. They were places where the very soul could hide, and maybe, if lucky, find something greater in the dark. So imagine it now. You're in the quietest part of the dugout, deeper than anyone would think to go. You kneel before a stone shelf carved with care, maybe stained with years of candle wax. Above you, the ceiling curves like the sky. Around you, the walls remember every whispered hymn, every shaking prayer, every desperate bargain. No army can hear you here. No law can reach you. It's just you, the dirt, the silence, and the weight of your own belief. And somehow, in this cramped, airless space, you've never felt closer to something sacred. Faith wasn't the only reason people went underground. Sometimes it was fear, sometimes it was survival, and sometimes, let's be honest, it was profit. Because when you strip away the hymns and the hopeful prayers, medieval life was just as full of scoundrels as saints, and not everyone who built a secret dugout was hiding from persecution or planning a quiet end. Some were running a business, a shady, secret, thoroughly illegal business, from the safety of a hole in the ground. Tonight, we're talking about the darker side of the dugout. The crime dens, smugglers' tunnels, and underground black markets that hid beneath the feet of unsuspecting towns. Picture it. You're in a border town in the late 1300s. The king's taxes have gone up again, half the local garrison is drunk on duty, and the merchants have started muttering about tariffs and tolls. But there's one man, let's call him Jakob, who seems to be doing just fine. His shop's always stocked, his boots are never muddy, and he disappears every few nights with a suspiciously full satchel and a wink. No one ever sees where he goes, but the next morning, there's new wine from France, salt from the coast, and an entire bag of cinnamon from somewhere no one can pronounce. Jakob doesn't own a cart. He doesn't travel. But what he does have is a hidden dugout beneath his home, complete with a tunnel that pops up in the abandoned granary on the edge of town. Welcome to medieval smuggling. These kinds of dugouts weren't large, just big enough to hold a few crates, a cot, maybe a small fire for heat. But they were carefully hidden and, more importantly, strategically placed. Dugouts near rivers were especially popular, as smuggled goods could arrive by boat and vanish into the earth before any tax collector noticed. In coastal regions, hidden chambers were carved into cliffs and accessed only at low tide. Some even used natural caves as the starting point, then expanded inward, carving new rooms, stash spots, and exits that only insiders knew existed. Smuggling wasn't just for luxuries. Sure, things like pepper, saffron, and silk were passed hand to hand in the dark, but so were forbidden texts, unapproved weapons, and in darker cases, people. In times of war or religious suppression, moving fugitives across borders was both risky and profitable. A well-connected smuggler could get you out of the kingdom and into safe territory, for a price, and you'd better believe some of those escape routes included nights spent cramped in airless dugouts, waiting for the signal to crawl on. One particularly elaborate system was discovered in the 1990s beneath a town in modern-day Slovakia. There, a network of tunnels and chambers stretched beneath what had once been a merchant quarter. Some had compartments built into the walls, just large enough to hold small parcels or wrapped bundles. Others had trapdoors leading to vertical shafts, possibly used to lift goods up into the floors of businesses above. There were even soot stains in corners that suggested fires had been lit at ground level to create smoke cover while the real work happened below. And this wasn't all cloak and dagger. Some townspeople knew, others turned a blind eye. In certain regions, underground crime networks became so entrenched that they operated in parallel to the town authorities. The local lord might not care how goods arrived, as long as he got his cut. And if a guard found himself standing above a hidden dugout, it wasn't uncommon for him to quietly walk away, maybe a little richer than when he arrived. The types of crimes committed in these underground spaces varied wildly. Some were makeshift counterfeiting workshops, complete with moulds for coins and charred remnants of forgeries. Others were gambling dens, where dice rolled and wagers whispered through the smoky air. And of course, there were the informal taverns, places where outlawed brews were served in chipped mugs to the hum of illicit songs. These weren't exactly five-star establishments. They were often damp, tight, and filled with the constant threat of betrayal. But for those who knew the signs, a lantern placed just so, a knock in a specific rhythm, they were havens of opportunity. In coastal England, there are stories of tunnel alehouses, underground rooms stocked with stolen drink, accessible only via hidden shafts under stables or cellars. You'd climb down a rope, duck through a passage, and find yourself in a dirt-walled room with a barrel in the corner and a man who definitely didn't ask for your name. Some even claim these places had menus, crude slates hung on the wall with etchings of what was available. Not exactly haute cuisine, but when you're drinking black market brandy in the flickering light of a tallow lamp, you're not here for the ambience. Naturally, all of this drew attention from the powers above. Kings, bishops, local lords, they hated losing control, especially if it meant losing coin. Raids were carried out, informants were bribed, and more than once a town awoke to the smell of smoke and the realization that a hidden tunnel had been torched, buried, or worse, collapsed with someone still inside. That's the other side of this life. For every successful smuggler, there were 10 who vanished without a whisper, swallowed by the same soil they tried to outwit. One debated case involves a chamber found beneath a market town in northern Italy. Inside were crates of bones, human, animal, mixed together, and scraps of leather marked with what some believe are symbols used by medieval thieves' guilds. Others think it was a charnel house or plague shelter. But the room's shape, its careful ventilation, and the presence of charred parchment suggest something more deliberate, more secretive. Maybe it was an execution site. Maybe it was punishment for getting caught. Or maybe it was just another group who went too far underground and never found their way back out. Scholars disagree about how widespread these crime dugouts were. Some say they were rare, more myth than fact. Others argue they were simply underreported, by design. After all, the whole point was that no one knew. But the evidence, burned lamps, half-finished tunnels, coins found where no coin should be, suggests a reality darker than any preserved parchment dares to admit. What's clear is that the underground was more than just a place of safety or sanctity. It was a space for opportunity, especially when the law looked the other way. It became a canvas for the bold, the desperate, the clever, and the criminal. And sometimes those four were the same person. So now, picture it. You descend a rope ladder into a chamber lit with low, warm firelight. Crates are stacked high against the walls, marked with unfamiliar sigils. A man hands you a flask. A woman counts coins. No one speaks loudly. Above, the world is law and order. Below, it's survival by wit and whisper. You've entered a place where the rules bend, where the walls hear secrets but never tell them, and where fortunes, both foul and fair, are built in silence, one shadowy deal at a time. Now let's turn from smugglers and scoundrels to something a little more noble, though no less secretive. Because not everyone who vanished underground in the Middle Ages was doing so for profit or escape. Some went below to protect something less tangible, yet infinitely more powerful: knowledge. Tonight you'll be stepping into the shadowy chambers of medieval hidden schools and scriptoria, places where books were worth more than gold, and writing in the wrong language could get you burned at the stake. This wasn't just about literacy. In an age when most people couldn't read, and most writing was confined to monasteries and cathedrals, knowledge itself became dangerous, especially when regimes changed. When kings turned against former allies, or the church fractured into warring factions, scrolls and texts that were once revered could be outlawed overnight. Suddenly the work of generations had to be hidden or destroyed. But some people chose a third option. They buried it, literally in dugouts. It's easy to imagine the scene. A monk, fleeing persecution, carrying a wrapped bundle of vellum tucked under his robe. He ducks into a forest, finds the hidden entrance behind a wall of thorns, and disappears into a narrow tunnel carved into the side of a hill. Inside, others wait, scribes, readers, maybe even a student or two quietly working by candlelight, copying lines onto parchment with hands stained in ink and fear. Welcome to the clandestine scriptorium. These underground learning spaces weren't just for copying religious texts. They housed philosophy, medicine, astronomy and history. Knowledge that certain regimes or dogmas wanted erased. Books written in Greek, Arabic or Hebrew. Texts that hinted at heliocentric theories or unorthodox theological ideas. In some places, even translations of the Bible into vernacular languages had to be hidden away, because the church deemed them heretical. The idea that a commoner could read scripture in his own tongue? Scandalous. Dangerous. So naturally, someone grabbed a chisel and started carving a classroom underground. One fascinating find in what is now modern-day Belgium revealed a multi-room dugout, long collapsed, but with enough intact to show its original purpose. In one chamber, fragments of parchment were discovered alongside inkwells, quill tips, and a long wooden bench carved into the wall. There were also shallow alcoves just big enough to hold scrolls or small volumes, and what appeared to be a writing table, its surface stained with centuries of dried ink. Above it, a narrow shaft let in a trickle of natural light, diffused through a horn panel fixed over the opening. Primitive, yes, but effective. Someone had spent long hours there, bent over words they likely weren't allowed to speak aloud above ground. Other underground schools were smaller, more mobile. A teacher might lead lessons in a hidden chamber beneath a barn or cellar, using chalk on stone walls. Students, young nobles, future clerics, or even curious peasants would gather on mats or low stools, learning Latin declensions by torchlight. In some parts of Ireland and Eastern Europe, there's evidence of hedge schools going underground during periods of suppression, their teachers passing on knowledge in whispers and shadows, always ready to scatter if footsteps were heard above. The materials were precious. Parchment was scraped and reused. Ink was brewed in secret, often using soot, vinegar, and wine. Mistakes weren't crossed out. They were carefully scraped away with sharpened bone or pumice. Books were copied not for beauty but for survival. Every letter had weight. Every line might be the only one of its kind left in the world. Imagine copying a text you barely understood, trusting that someday someone else might read it and find meaning, if it survived. And yes, these underground schools had their own kind of rituals and codes. Many used symbolic markings carved into the chamber walls, half-hidden signs to indicate where materials were hidden or whether the site was safe. A circle with a dot might mean knowledge stored. A crooked cross might mean beware, danger. Some scriptoria even developed cipher systems to write parts of their texts, encoding key phrases so that if the work was discovered, its full meaning would remain hidden. Not all of it was high-minded preservation, of course. In more than a few cases, underground scriptoria were used to forge documents, land claims, letters of legitimacy, or doctored genealogies to help nobles maintain power. If a king demanded proof of your bloodline and you didn't have it, well, a quiet scribe in a quiet hole could make you a count in a single evening. Risky business, but profitable, and sometimes surprisingly well done. Some forged documents from these periods are still being debated by scholars today. Real or fake? It's hard to tell when the original copy was made under 2 feet of dirt with a stolen quill. One particularly mysterious case involves a chamber found beneath an abandoned monastery in the Alps. Inside were dozens of wax tablets, reusable writing surfaces used for note-taking or instruction, stacked in a stone-lined recess. Alongside them, wrapped in decayed linen, was a book written entirely in mirror script, meaning it could only be read when held to a reflective surface. Was it encrypted for safety? Written by a left-handed scribe in a hurry? Or something else entirely? No one's sure, but the content was banned theology, the kind that got people excommunicated, or worse. There's a long-standing debate among historians about whether these underground schools were widespread or exceptional. Some argue that only a handful ever existed, mostly in politically turbulent regions. Others point out that the lack of physical evidence is exactly what you'd expect from places designed to never be found. Either way, we know that knowledge wasn't always welcome above ground, and that people went to great lengths to protect it below. Perhaps the most romantic story comes from a 15th century Czech village. where a secret dugout school supposedly operated for over 30 years, hidden beneath a cooper's workshop. According to legend, the students, mostly young boys from nearby villages, would come disguised as apprentices, descending into the earth to learn history, math, and scripture. When the teacher died, he was buried in the same chamber, his grave hidden beneath the classroom bench. No markers. Just a man who passed on everything he knew and then disappeared into the dirt. So picture it now. You're crouched beside a wall lined with half-finished texts, the air thick with ink and old sweat. The fire flickers low, and across from you, a figure bends over a scroll, whispering Latin phrases you barely understand. No one above knows what's happening here. No one hears the scratching of quill on vellum, the hushed recitation of forbidden facts. But knowledge is alive, preserved, protected, waiting for a day when it won't have to hide underground anymore. You've seen the secret schools now, the scribes in the dark copying forbidden texts with soot-stained fingers and sore backs. You've heard the shuffle of pages and the scratch of quills, all carried out in silence beneath the feet of an unaware and often hostile world. But not all whispers underground were about science or scripture. Some were bigger, stranger, wrapped in symbols, secrecy, and enough conspiracy theories to fill a medieval Reddit forum. Because now we've reached one of the most debated, mysterious, and eyebrow-raising corners of the underground world, the Templar theory. Yes, the Knights Templar. Cue the dramatic Gregorian chanting. Everyone knows the basics. The white cloaks with red crosses, the crusades, the secret rituals that probably involved more paperwork than people like to imagine. But what fewer people know is how the Templars might have gone underground, literally. Because when the order was disbanded in the early 14th century, accused of heresy, idolatry, and just generally being too rich and secretive for the Pope's taste, they didn't all go quietly. Some were arrested, some were burned, but some vanished. And the theory goes that they didn't just run, they dug. Now, let's be clear. Much of this is speculation, fringe history, the kind that makes archaeologists frown and treasure hunters pack their bags. But the idea is this, that remnants of the Templars, seeking to preserve their knowledge, their treasures, or their rituals, went underground, creating a network of concealed chambers, buried vaults, and secret meeting halls across Europe. There's some odd physical evidence to support this. Scattered across France, Portugal, and parts of the British Isles are mysterious subterranean structures that don't match typical medieval dugouts. They're too elaborate, too symbolic. Take for instance the Royston Cave in England. Discovered by accident in 1742 under a market town, it's a bell-shaped chamber carved into chalk, with walls covered in bizarre carvings. Knights, saints, a figure thought to be the Virgin Mary, and even what some believe is a stylized depiction of the Holy Grail. Scholars can't agree on who built it or why. Templar origin, a hermit's chapel, a really committed stonemason with a religious obsession? No one knows for sure. The chamber had no visible entrance. It was completely sealed, suggesting that access was controlled and hidden. And the symbols, well, they don't scream peasant hideout. They suggest something more ceremonial, something meant to be preserved, not just survived in. Some researchers believe it was used for initiation rituals, perhaps by secret Templar cells operating in exile after the Order's fall. Others scoff at the idea and say it's just another weird religious site lost to history. But the legend refuses to go away, and Royston's not the only one. In Portugal, beneath the Convento de Cristo in Tomar, a former Templar stronghold, there are rumoured to be sealed chambers with no documented purpose, aligned with celestial events. There are legends of buried tunnels now collapsed leading into the surrounding hills. Some claim that Templar artefacts were hidden there, moved from the Holy Land, never meant to be found by ordinary hands, or at least not until someone proved themselves worthy by, I don't know, solving a riddle written in Latin and surviving 3 booby traps. Some of the supposed Templar dugouts don't even resemble homes or chapels. Instead, they appear to be symbolic structures, with floor plans echoing the shape of the Jerusalem temple, or incorporating sacred geometry, circles, crosses and octagons cut into the floor or ceiling. A few even have pillars, which is frankly overkill unless you're trying to impress someone important. The precision of these features has led some to believe these weren't shelters at all, but repositories, places meant to hold something sacred or forbidden, something that had to be hidden, preserved, and protected with the utmost secrecy. Now, before we let the Dan Brown theories run completely wild, it's worth mentioning that not everyone agrees these sites have anything to do with the Templars. Some point out that carvings and underground chapels were common across Europe. Plenty of hermits, monks, and mystery-loving locals dug their own hideaways without needing a secret nightly order as an excuse. But then again, many of those structures lack the specific repeated symbols, the crosses, the swords, the double-headed eagles, that seem to cluster around the more suspicious sites. There's also the question of timing. Many of these underground spaces were either created or expanded around the time of the Templar suppression, late 13th to early 14th century. It's not proof, but it is suggestive, like a story that keeps showing up in places no one expected. And of course, there's the fringe stuff. The rumours of lost treasure, the Ark of the Covenant, the bloodline of Christ, all supposedly hidden in a chamber beneath some sleepy European village, just waiting for the right adventurer to show up with a lantern and a map. Most of that's just modern fantasy, layers of myth wrapped around a core of real historical mystery. But then again, that's how history often works. A little truth, a lot of embellishment, and a whole lot of people digging in the dark, hoping for answers. Some of the underground spaces attributed to the Templars were clearly built with skill and resources. Not just peasants with a shovel and a prayer, but trained engineers, maybe even stoneworkers brought in from monasteries or defunct crusader castles. The walls are straight, the ventilation is clever, the acoustics carefully designed. In one chamber, a whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other, something that requires a surprising level of architectural knowledge. Ritual space, a place for secret communication, or just a quirk of design. Take your pick. The most persistent scholarly debate centres around intent. Were these just hideouts used by fleeing Templars, or were they created as part of a deliberate underground network? If it's the latter, then we're talking about a level of organisation that persisted even after the official end of the order. And if that's true, well, it means someone, somewhere, kept the fire burning underground for decades, maybe centuries. So what does that mean for your sleepy little earth chamber? If you start noticing strange symbols on the walls, or if the room echoes even when it shouldn't, or if someone with a weathered map and a metal detector starts poking around nearby, maybe you're standing above more than just a peasant's pantry. Maybe, just maybe, the earth beneath you remembers things it was never supposed to tell. Now picture this. You're deep inside a dugout. Not a shelter, not a home, but something older, stranger. The walls are lined with faded symbols. A single stone slab rests at the centre, unmarked but clearly placed with purpose. There's a hush in the air that doesn't feel natural. You're not sure why, but you whisper, and in that moment, the dirt doesn't feel like just soil anymore. It feels like a secret, waiting to be heard. Let's climb out of the rabbit hole of Templars and cryptic stonework, just for now, and turn our flickering lamp towards something a little more grounded, but no less fascinating. Because even in their most mundane form, these medieval dugouts weren't isolated events. They were part of a larger ecosystem of survival, constantly evolving, traded through oral traditions and hard-earned experience. And as generations passed, the knowledge of how to build and maintain these hidden shelters didn't just fade into folklore, it became folk engineering, passed from hand to hand like a family heirloom you couldn't wear, but you might have to live in one day. So tonight, let's look at how the craft of building dugouts was preserved, improved, and handed down, not by architects or monks, but by regular people with mud under their nails and urgency in their veins. Because a lot of what we know about medieval underground survival isn't found in books. It's found in habits, rituals, and clever little shortcuts buried in the soil itself. It often started with childhood lessons. In rural, communities prone to conflict, border regions, raided towns, persecuted religious groups, kids didn't just grow up learning to herd goats or fetch firewood. They also learned where the nearest hiding spot was, how to dig a vent without collapsing a tunnel, and how to stay quiet when fear threatened to pry your lungs open. You could call it survival school, or you could just call it life. Some of this knowledge was wrapped in stories, passed down around fires. A tale about Old Marek, who built a home so deep the wolves howled above it but never found him, or a whispered legend of a widow who survived a winter siege by retreating into a cave lined with moss and breathing through a reed like a fish. Most of these tales were exaggerated, but inside each one was a core of truth, an idea, a trick, a blueprint hidden in metaphor. In some regions, the knowledge was more direct. Families maintained secret manuals, not written documents, but shared understandings of where to dig, when to reinforce, how to hide a chimney vent in a rock wall so well that even a hunter wouldn't find it. These weren't secrets out of greed. They were guarded out of necessity. If too many people knew about your family's dugout, it stopped being a sanctuary and became a liability. Over time, these techniques refined into a kind of regional science. In swampy areas, dugouts included drainage trenches and raised reed floors to keep the chamber dry. In mountain regions, they were carved into soft rock rather than soil, taking advantage of natural fissures and air pockets. In sandy coastal lands, walls were lined with woven turf and driftwood, creating collapsible structures that were quick to dismantle if the authorities came sniffing around. Some builders left behind marker stones, symbols carved just above the entrance or along a guiding path, unreadable to outsiders, instantly recognizable to those who knew the code. One symbol might mean safe chamber, water inside. Another might warn, collapsed, don't dig. These were like medieval QR codes, etched in moss-covered secrecy. It wasn't just the physical structure that evolved either. Social rules formed around the use of dugouts. In many communities, a family with a hidden chamber had a quiet, unspoken obligation to share in times of danger. There were even accounts, rare but real, of communal dugouts, built by small villages as a shared fallback. These tended to be larger, multi-room structures, often disguised beneath barns, granaries, or stone outbuildings. Inside, families had marked areas, straw mats with personal items, storage nooks with initials scratched into the walls, even family symbols burned into wood beams like subterranean coats of arms. But just as often, these arrangements led to tension. Who got to use the dugout first? Who controlled the supplies? What happened if the shelter was discovered because someone didn't follow the rules? These weren't theoretical debates. They happened in hushed voices during long winters when war crept closer and choices became scarce. In some cases, families dug breakaway tunnels, tiny side passages leading to personal bolt holes, just in case communal trust ran out before the danger did. Craft knowledge also spread horizontally, traded between travellers, refugees, and peddlers. You'd have someone passing through who'd just fled a siege or a pogrom, and before they left, they'd whisper a technique: how to build a smoke baffle with river clay, how to reinforce a ceiling with bone and brushwood, how to mask a fresh dig with sheep dung so it wouldn't attract dogs. These weren't tips you found in books. These were earned and only shared when the stakes were mutual. There's still debate about whether these techniques ever reached true professional status. Were there people who specialised in dugout construction, secret builders for hire? Probably not in an organised sense, but there were certainly individuals known for their skill. Maybe it was the old man on the edge of town who never spoke much, but had dug more tunnels than a badger, or the carpenter's widow who could hide a door in plain sight. Every community had someone like that, the go-to when you needed to vanish below, and sometimes the knowledge got weird. Fringe methods crept in. People swore by certain rituals during digging, never starting on a Monday, or only turning the soil with your left hand for the first stroke. Some believed you had to leave an offering in the wall, a coin, a feather, a sliver of bone, to calm the earth and prevent collapse. Superstition? Maybe. But when you're carving your life into mud and darkness, a little ceremony feels like a small price to pay. Even today, you can find echoes of this tradition in places where underground living persisted longer than most realise. In parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, dugouts remained in use into the 19th and even early 20th century, not as emergencies, but as seasonal homes, storm shelters, or remote hunting cabins. Some of them follow the same patterns medieval builders used centuries before: south-facing entries, stone-lined fire pits, turf-covered roofs. The techniques never truly died. They just slipped deeper underground. And now, if you squint just right, you can see the thread. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter how to check for airflow. A father drawing a tunnel path in the dirt with a stick. A neighbour showing you which herbs to pack in a smoke vent so the scent blends into the forest. It's not architecture, it's memory. Layered, tested and alive. So picture it. You're crouched by the entrance to your family's dugout, the same one your grandfather helped carve when he was young and afraid. The lintel still bears his mark, a carved circle with a line through it, his way of saying safe now. You run your hand over it before you enter, as everyone in your family does. Inside, the walls are smooth, the corners reinforced, the air cool but dry. You didn't just build this place, you inherited it. Every stone, every tunnel, every trick etched into your muscle memory. You are one of thousands, quiet engineers of survival, carving safety into the earth and passing it down in whispers. You know the layout by now. The carved walls, the hidden vent, the packed floor where generations have stepped quietly to avoid detection. Maybe there's a faded mark on the ceiling where your great-grandmother once hung a cooking pot, or a nail embedded in the dirt wall where someone strung up a single flickering lantern. It's all familiar until it isn't, because no matter how well you dig, how cleverly you hide, nature always finds a way to remind you that you're not the only one living underground. Tonight, we're exploring the less romantic side of medieval dugout life. Pests, predators, and parasites. All the things that go bump in the dirt and nibble at your peace of mind, and sometimes your ankles. Let's start with the obvious. Rats. You knew it was coming. Wherever humans go, rats are never far behind. If you were storing even a handful of grain underground, especially in sealed jars or sacks, you might as well have put up a sign. Free dinner. Enter here. The problem wasn't just noise or the occasional tail brushing your foot in the dark. It was the risk of contamination, disease, and full-on infestation. And in a space where your entire family sleeps in close quarters, one sick rat could mean everyone waking up coughing. So how did people deal with them? A few methods, most of them unpleasant. Traps were rare but not unheard of, simple snares or drop weights triggered by bait. But more often, dugout dwellers relied on cats, which were not just tolerated but cherished underground. These weren't pampered pets. They were frontline soldiers in the war against vermin. In one Polish dugout, archaeologists found scratched markings near food storage, as if someone had carved a reminder to feed the cat. Or possibly, don't store food here ever again, the rats have claimed it. You can imagine the tension of trying to sleep while listening for the soft, wet shuffle of paws across your food stores, hoping it's your feline friend and not something worse. But rats weren't the only unwanted guests. Insects, of course, came with the territory, especially in damp, unventilated spaces. Lice and fleas could spread rapidly, especially in family shelters where hygiene was, let's say, limited by circumstance. Bedding, usually made of straw, moss, or old cloth, was the perfect breeding ground. People tried to manage it by burning infested bedding, boiling what they could, or rubbing the seams of clothes with ashes or aromatic herbs like wormwood and tansy. Some even hung bundles of garlic or onion skins, believing the smell would drive away insects. Did it work? Marginally. But when you're itching, through a lice infestation during a famine, any hope is worth grabbing onto. Now, let's talk about the larger threats. The four-legged ones with fangs, claws and a nose for warm blood. Wild animals posed a real problem in certain regions, especially when dugouts were built near woods or mountains. Wolves, for instance, generally kept their distance, but a starving one, or worse, a desperate pack during a harsh winter, that was different. There are stories, half folktale, half fact, of wolves digging into shallow dugouts, lured by the smell of cooking or the sound of children. In one documented case from the Carpathians, a family dug a trap tunnel, a fake corridor leading away from the real chamber and ending in a spiked pit, meant to catch animals or people that got too curious. Bears too were a concern in forested regions. While less likely to target humans, they were known to break into dugouts during food shortages, especially if food was stored improperly or the entrance wasn't securely blocked. And once inside, well, let's just say you don't negotiate with a bear in a 6-foot by 8-foot dirt room. Some dugouts use stone slabs or heavy logs as internal barriers, rolled into place each night like medieval garage doors. These weren't just for keeping animals out. Sometimes they were for keeping your livestock in, especially if the weather turned or the wolves circled too close. Of course, it wasn't all external threats. Sometimes the worst problems were within the soil itself. Mould and fungus, especially black mould, thrived in poorly ventilated dugouts. Without sunlight and airflow, spores could bloom on walls, ceilings, even clothing. Respiratory illness was a common and deadly risk. In one account, a healer noted how certain dugouts gave off a sweet, damp sickness, which he believed was the earth spitting back poison. And while he didn't know the science, he wasn't wrong. People fought back however they could. Some lined walls with charcoal, believing it purified the air, and to some extent it did. Others burned juniper and resin to combat foul odours and airborne illness. A few clever builders carved drainage trenches along the walls and floors to prevent water pooling, because standing water was a one-way ticket to rot, bugs and worse. And if all else failed, you moved, or collapsed the dugout and started over somewhere drier. But even when the pests weren't visible, you were never truly alone. The earth moves, it breathes, and sometimes it settles. More than one dugout occupant has woken in the middle of the night to the sound of shifting dirt, like a groan rolling through the walls. Sometimes it's nothing, a bit of pressure, a small collapse in a disused tunnel. Other times, it's the beginning of something worse. In one chilling case, a family of 5 was found centuries later buried beneath a collapsed dugout chamber, their bodies curled in sleeping positions as if they'd never had a moment's warning. Scholars still debate what caused it. Was it a flood? A fire? Or just the slow, inevitable pull of gravity and time? It wasn't all horror stories, though. Some people learned to live with nature, striking a balance, burying certain herbs in the threshold to ward off bugs, letting certain spiders stay because they kept worse creatures at bay. In one account from Eastern Europe, a woman wrote about a particular frog that lived near her family's dugout vent. She fed it crumbs, and in return it kept the insect population down. A mutually beneficial lease agreement, basically. And while there's no archaeological proof of this next part, it's a recurring theme in oral accounts. The noise, not rats, not wolves, not the wind. Something else. A low rumble or knocking or whispering in the earth, sometimes just before dawn, sometimes after long periods of silence. Most wrote it off as shifting soil, deep water, or the structure adjusting. But others believed the land itself responded to the presence of people, that the earth listened, and when it didn't like what it heard, it reminded you who really owned the space. So now picture this. You're lying in your dugout, bundled in wool, eyes shut. A soft drip echoes from the back corner. Something skitters across the floor, maybe a beetle, maybe not. Your cat stirs near your feet, alert but unbothered. Somewhere in the wall, the earth shifts slightly, a faint crumble like an old sigh. You open your eyes and look into the darkness, and for a second, you remember that you're not alone down here. You never were, but if you're lucky and careful, you'll make it through the night just like your ancestors did, watching the dirt, listening for sounds that don't belong, and whispering thanks to the walls that haven't fallen yet. By now, the dugout isn't just a place, it's a world of its own. You know the smells, the feel of the earth beneath your fingertips, the soft hush of footsteps in the corridor. You know where to duck so you don't crack your head, where the draft sneaks in when the weather shifts, and how many seconds it takes for your eyes to adjust when you blow out the lantern. You've made peace with the dark. Maybe you've even grown to like it. But what happens when it's time to come back up? Tonight, we climb out of the quiet and look at what it meant to return to the surface after living underground, whether for a night, a season, or a generation. Let's not sugarcoat it. Re-entry wasn't always simple. If you were hiding from something, resurfacing meant risk. Soldiers could still be nearby. The taxmen might still be sniffing around. And even if the threat was gone, the world you emerged into might not be the same one you left. Crops burned, neighbours disappeared, homes looted or turned to ash. You crawled up from safety into a place that had moved on without you. Or worse, been destroyed while you were down below. But let's start small. You've been in the dugout for 3 days, waiting out a band of raiders. The last sound you heard was the crack of a torch and the distant scream of a goat. Then, silence. You ease open the hatch. Just an inch at first. Cold air rushes in. Birdsong finally. You crawl out slow and stiff, blinking against sunlight like a mole, and the surface feels enormous. blinding, untrustworthy. It's a strange thing, being overwhelmed by sky. But it happened, often. Many accounts from later periods describe people feeling disoriented or even panicked when first stepping out after a long underground stay. Some had to sit for hours before their eyes adjusted, before their legs remembered how to walk more than 5 feet at a time. In some areas, this transition became a ritual, especially for communities that used dugouts seasonally. The return wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. You left the ground, re-entered the world of men, and marked the moment with fire, song, or food. Spring festivals in certain parts of Eastern Europe may have roots in this tradition. Families would emerge from semi-subterranean homes after the thaw and celebrate with a small fire at the threshold, a way of warming the soil one last time before they moved fully into the open world again. But not everyone returned to open arms. In many cases, the decision to live underground marked you as different, even dangerous, to those who had stayed above. People whispered, called you strange, accused you of consorting with spirits or hoarding food while others suffered. One account from the Alps tells of a family that re-emerged after a months-long snowstorm to find their village all but emptied, and those who remained saw them as ghosts, not neighbours. They'd vanished into the mountain and come back changed. Or so the story went. Sometimes people didn't come back at all, not because they died, but because they chose to stay underground. This happened more often than you'd expect. A family might return to the surface, only to find their home claimed by someone else, their fields seized, their names stricken from the rolls. At that point, going back down into the earth wasn't defeat. It was freedom. There are stories, half myth, half likely truth, of entire generations that lived almost entirely below ground, venturing out only to trade, gather firewood, or bury their dead. In these cases, the dugout stopped being a shelter and became a primary home. Improvements were made, roofs were reinforced, ventilation systems upgraded, some even added decorative touches, patterned wood beams, painted niches, family symbols carved into lintels. These were no longer hasty hideouts. They were intentional, lived in, loved, and when the surface world called, many simply didn't answer. But for those who did choose to return, there were challenges. Rebuilding was the biggest. Dugouts protected you from destruction, but they didn't protect your house, your barn, your orchard. Many families came up to find bare ground where their livelihoods had been. Rebuilding took time, strength, and trust. In some cases, communities came together, pooling tools and labour. In others, it was every household for itself, especially if there was tension over who had prepared a dugout and who hadn't. Jealousy was a quiet poison in those times. Why did they survive, and not us? No easy answer. Some medieval laws actually touched on this issue. In a few feudal regions, there were penalties for digging unauthorised shelters, usually because it was seen as a way of dodging taxes or military conscription. Lords didn't like their peasants hiding. They liked them working, fighting, and most of all, paying. And if you came out of the ground healthier, better fed, and less traumatised than your neighbours, questions were asked. Some nobles went so far as to claim ownership of dugouts built on their land, arguing that the structure and whatever was stored inside belonged to the estate. More than one legal dispute emerged over a dugout found after a conflict, full of tools or grain, or the occasional treasure someone never had the chance to retrieve. For families that returned to stability, the dugout wasn't just abandoned. It was maintained like a storm shelter or a sacred space. Even if it wasn't used again for years, it was checked each season, repaired after floods, stocked quietly with salt, flint and dry kindling. It was insurance. A reminder that safety was something you had to build yourself, with your own hands, and keep in working order, just in case. And there were those who couldn't let go. Even after peace returned or famine passed, some people still slipped underground at night, for comfort, for quiet, for the feeling of control in a world where that was in short supply. A few never slept above ground again. These weren't madmen. They were simply people who'd learned that the surface didn't always offer safety, that sometimes the warm, quiet dark was better than the cold uncertainty of the open. There's a strange poetic account from a traveller in 15th century Hungary. He met an old woman who still lived part-time in a dugout behind her cottage, decades after the last war. When asked why, she simply said, "The earth remembers me, the house forgets." Make of that what you will, so imagine it now. You're standing in the threshold of your dugout, half in shadow, half in sun. The world above is bright, noisy, too fast. The ground beneath is familiar, calm, still yours. You step out slowly, eyes squinting, lungs full. The sky is massive. The trees look thinner somehow. Everything has changed, and nothing has. But you know one thing. If the wind ever turns cold again, if strangers ever march across the horizon, you'll know where to go. And this time, the ladder's already built. Let's face it, by now, you've spent so much time down in these dugouts that the thought of choosing to live in one might not sound so strange anymore. There's a certain logic to it. Low cost, temperature stability, excellent insulation from both weather and unwanted guests. And sure, there's the occasional rat. And maybe the odd collapse if you get cocky with your ceiling angles. But in some parts of the medieval world, people didn't just use dugouts as emergency hideaways. They built entire villages underground, on purpose, and lived in them year-round. So tonight, we're going deeper, not just metaphorically, into the permanent underground settlements that blurred the line between survival and lifestyle. Let's start in the obvious place, Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey. The volcanic rock in this region is soft, carvable, and weirdly cooperative. People figured that out early, probably sometime before the medieval period, but by the Middle Ages, entire underground cities were in full swing. And we're not talking about a few interconnected hidey holes in a chamber with a torch. We're talking about multi-level settlements, some plunging 8 stories underground, with ventilation shafts, wells, churches, schools, animal stalls, wine presses, kitchens, storage rooms, and long winding corridors that would make any modern doomsday prepper weep with admiration. The most famous of these is Derinkuyu, and if you're picturing a dirt tunnel with a few straw mats, think again. This place could house up to 20,000 people. 20,000 underground. Now, to be fair, that was likely during emergencies, not year-round occupancy, but still. At its peak, Derinkuyu was a full-blown subterranean city, complete with sophisticated airflow systems and massive circular stone doors, like millstones, that could be rolled in front of tunnels to block intruders. It was part fortress, part fallout shelter, part ant colony with real estate planning. But Derinkuyu wasn't alone. Cappadocia is riddled with dozens, possibly hundreds of similar settlements, big and small, some connected by long underground passageways stretching miles between cities. Theories differ on why they were built. Some say it was to avoid persecution from invading forces, early Christians escaping Roman, Arab or Mongol armies. Others argue they were seasonal refuges, used to escape the summer heat or winter cold. There's even speculation that they started out as simple food storage chambers and over generations just expanded. You dig a pantry, then a sleeping room, then a prayer alcove, and suddenly you're living in a 5-story dirt condo. Architecturally, these underground cities were marvels of low-tech engineering. They had air shafts as deep as 180 feet, carefully placed so that airflow would circulate naturally, keeping the lower levels breathable. Water was accessed through wells protected from surface contamination, ensuring survival during sieges. Tunnels were deliberately narrow to slow invaders, and staircases curved or turned sharply to make it impossible for large groups to charge in. In essence, every inch of the place was built not just to live in, but to outlive everyone else. And while Cappadocia is the showiest example, it wasn't alone. There are lesser known, but no less fascinating underground villages across parts of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Iran, and even parts of China. In Iran's Nushabad, locals built underground homes called Oe, complete with narrow tunnels and rooms carved to follow the contours of the earth. The reason? Blistering summer heat. Down below, the temperature remained steady and survivable, and during times of war, these same tunnels doubled as defensive systems. In Georgia's Vardzia, a massive cliffside complex carved by monks, the underground world was both spiritual and strategic. Monks built entire churches, libraries, and residences into the rock. While not technically dugouts in the floor, the concept was the same: earth as fortress, earth as sanctuary. The deeper question, though, is why anyone would choose this life if they didn't have to. And here's where it gets interesting. These places didn't just protect against soldiers. They protected against climate, drought, plague, and political chaos, the great horsemen of the medieval apocalypse. If you lived on a plain where armies marched through every other decade, or if you were part of a religious group constantly hunted by someone with a crown, going underground was the most rational choice you could make. But it wasn't all survival and suffering. There's evidence of art and decoration in these underground homes, painted walls, carved crosses, even attempts at patterning on ceilings. One chamber in Kemakli, another Cappadocian city, shows grooves where a loom once stood, suggesting underground textile production. Another chamber has a hollowed-out alcove where someone placed a bench and a low table, maybe a dining nook, maybe a quiet spot for reading or praying, or just hiding from the noise of 20,000 of your closest neighbours. Of course, not everyone loved the underground life. These spaces were humid, dark and claustrophobic. Light came from oil lamps or small fire pits, and without proper airflow, smoke built up fast. You needed constant maintenance to avoid collapse. And psychologically, the toll was real. Living in the dark for weeks or months could distort sleep, dull senses, and amplify tensions between people. Some communities rotated surface time, letting residents spend a few hours topside to stretch and breathe before diving back into the earth. Others built light wells, shafts that allowed daylight to filter into communal spaces, though these also risked detection. One mystery still debated by scholars is how exactly the construction was coordinated. Building an underground city isn't a weekend DIY project. It takes long-term planning, organised labour, and a shared sense of purpose. Some believe there were designated architects, experienced diggers who passed down techniques and assigned tasks. Others think it was communal, with families carving their own homes and then gradually connecting to each other. Either way, the logistics are mind-blowing. Even today, with all our tech and safety standards, you'd struggle to pull off what these medieval villagers did with nothing but chisels, baskets, and nerves of steel. It's hard to ignore the symbolism here. These weren't just buildings, they were acts of resistance, monuments to a people who looked at the surface and said, "No thanks, we'll build our own world." And they did. Quietly, carefully, layer by layer, carving out lives where the sun never shone, but safety was always a few steps away. So now imagine it. You wake in a chamber 3 stories underground. The air is cool. A tiny flame flickers in a wall niche. The stone walls curve around you like a cradle. Outside, someone is baking bread in a clay oven. A child's laughter echoes faintly from the communal hall. You're not hiding. You're home. And above you the world turns on, unaware that beneath its feet lies a city carved by hands determined not to be erased. It's one thing to carve out a shelter for you and your family. It's another thing entirely to build an entire city beneath the feet of invaders or the fickle weight of the seasons. But there's something more intimate, more psychological that lingers in the walls of these underground spaces. We've talked about the who, the how, the where. Now let's talk about the why in a deeper way. Because what drives a person, or an entire community, to disappear beneath the soil isn't just fear or strategy. Sometimes it's about control, about carving out a space where the outside world can't follow. Tonight we're descending into the psychology of underground living, and how people in the medieval world learned to cope with, and even embrace, the isolation, silence and darkness of life beneath the earth. Let's start with the obvious, the absence of light. In a world where artificial light was limited to fire, and where fire meant smoke, smell and precious fuel, most dugout dwellers lived in dimness. Not pitch black, but a flickering, muted palette of oranges and shadows. The human brain does strange things in that kind of lighting. Time warps. Space feels tighter. You lose your sense of scale, and over days or weeks, you start to rely more on your ears than your eyes. There are medieval accounts of people saying they saw voices, or that the walls seemed to move slightly in the corners of their vision. Hallucinations caused by low light, stress, or oxygen-poor air. Not madness, just a brain doing its best with too little input. There's even a theory among some modern scholars that long-term underground living rewired the senses. People learned to listen better, to move more quietly, to track time by the habits of others, the sounds of waking, of prayer, of footsteps in the hall. In some ways, dugout life became a collective rhythm, where everyone's perception filled in the gaps left by the world they couldn't see. Then there's the silence, or more accurately the lack of distant noise. In a forest, you hear the wind, the birds, the trees. In a village, carts and dogs and voices. But underground? It's you, your breath, the drip of condensation, maybe the scratch of a rat or the crackle of firewood. Some people found it comforting, others found it terrifying. There are medieval descriptions of the hush that presses on the bones, or the feeling of being watched by the dark. Some cultures believed the earth had a spirit, not necessarily evil, but not quite friendly either. And when you live inside it, you have to respect it. Walk gently, don't speak too loud, don't take more than you need. Children raised in dugouts often developed a kind of underground etiquette, stepping softly, never shouting, avoiding sudden movements. In a way, the space shaped their behaviour from birth. There's even anecdotal evidence that kids who grew up in these environments had stronger spatial awareness, possibly because their brains had to navigate narrow spaces daily. Or maybe they were just tired of stubbing their toes. But let's get darker for a moment. Because as much as dugouts protected people physically, they could be mentally punishing, especially during long isolation. Imagine a siege that lasts 4 months. You're in a cramped chamber with 7 other people, only 2 of whom you actually like. There's no privacy, no real day or night. The air gets stale, food becomes monotonous, someone's always coughing. At some point, the issue isn't survival, it's endurance. How do you not lose yourself in that kind of space? Communities developed coping mechanisms. Some were rituals, lighting a fire at the same time each evening, telling stories after the evening meal, marking days on the wall. Others were more subtle, a shared song, a quiet rotation of chores, a strict schedule for who got to sit closest to the fire. These weren't just habits, they were anchors, ways to keep the mind tethered when everything around you blurred into soil and shadow. Faith helped too, of course. Religious belief often provided a framework that made suffering feel purposeful. If the world above was corrupt, then retreating underground could feel like a form of spiritual cleansing, a monastic retreat, even if it wasn't by choice. Psalms were whispered, prayers were etched into the walls. One woman, hiding during a pogrom, scratched a short phrase into the stone of her dugout. "He sees me though the sky does not." It's haunting and oddly hopeful. She was buried under 2 meters of earth, but in her mind she wasn't hidden. She was held. Still, not everyone adapted well. Some people cracked. One story from 14th century France tells of a man who refused to leave his dugout even after the danger passed. He'd lived underground for a year with his family and couldn't bear the thought of returning to open space. Eventually he was pulled out by force. He didn't speak for days afterward. Whether it was agoraphobia, trauma, or simply a kind of unspoken loyalty to the earth that had kept him safe, we'll never know. But he wasn't alone. Other accounts describe people going blind from light exposure, or freezing in place when they heard birdsong for the first time in months. And then, there were the underground dreamers, the people who found something beautiful in the darkness, artists who carved into the walls, not just for function, but for expression. One anonymous figure in Cappadocia is believed to have carved a full series of biblical scenes into the soft tufa rock, probably by firelight, possibly over years, not for praise, not for anyone else, just to mark time, just to remember. In Eastern Europe, some dugouts show signs of decorative work. Patterned ceilings, painted stone, carved borders around hearths. They weren't making do, they were making meaning. And that's the thing about life underground. It strips away everything non-essential. It's raw, focused, elemental. You learn what matters fast: warmth, food, silence, a good pair of boots. You stop caring about things that don't help you breathe or sleep, but you also gain a kind of clarity. The world above is chaotic. Down here you know where every stone is. You know what every sound means. You build a relationship with the dirt, not as an enemy, but as a reluctant partner. So now picture it. You're sitting in a dugout, fire low, voices hushed. Someone hums a lullaby without thinking. Another person traces a line into the wall, maybe counting days, maybe drawing a leaf they miss. The air smells of earth and smoke and something old. You feel the weight of the soil above you, pressing down, not crushing, just reminding. You're here, you're alive. And even in the dark, you're part of something larger, a tradition, a story, a quiet resistance to everything that rages above. Maybe this is survival, or maybe, in its own strange way, it's peace. Let's lift our eyes just slightly from the darkness now, not all the way into the light, but toward that hazy space where the underground meets the surface, where stories start to blur into legend. Because the truth is, not all dugouts left behind walls you can still touch, or tunnels you can crawl through. Some left only stories, and some of those stories are strange. Tonight we're stepping softly into the realm of folklore, myth, and buried memory. The tales that grew like roots around the real places people once called home beneath the earth. Every culture that relied on underground shelters seems to have left behind whispers about them. Not just practical knowledge passed through generations, but ghost stories, curses, warnings, and wonders. Because when you live in the dark, anything you can't explain starts to feel bigger. And when you emerge, months or years later, what you remember starts to shift. So let's start with something classic. The story of the sealed door. Across Europe, there are dozens of variations of this tale. A family hides underground during a war or a plague. They survive. But the entrance collapses, or worse, someone seals it on purpose, believing no one inside lived. Decades pass, maybe centuries. And then someone digs up the site, or finds a strange gap in a cliff, or hears a hollow knock beneath the floorboards. Inside, bones, tools, maybe even something still burning, like a lamp that should have gone out long ago. These stories almost always end with someone saying, "Let them rest," and resealing the place, as if disturbing that space would somehow curse the living. Sometimes the stories are more supernatural. In certain Slavic regions, there's a belief that dugouts left abandoned too long become homes for chorty, trickster spirits who mimic the last voices heard inside. Travellers who camp too close are said to hear muffled conversations from beneath the soil, or laughter from holes that lead nowhere. One particularly eerie version tells of a shepherd who found a shallow cave and slept inside to avoid the cold. He emerged the next morning convinced only a single night had passed, but the nearby village, gone, overgrown, silent. He had slept 100 years, or so they say. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, fairy mounds are sometimes linked to ancient dugouts, especially those that collapse or vanish from local maps. The idea is that when humans abandon a space so connected to the land takes it back, and something else moves in. To this day, some farmers refuse to dig near old hillocks or sunken chambers, not for practical reasons, but because the earth there is said to remember too much. Other stories are more heroic, casting dugout dwellers as guardians of lost knowledge or sacred items. One French legend speaks of the hidden chamber of Orville, where a group of monks fled underground with a forbidden text and vanished into a self-built labyrinth. The chamber was said to be lit by a single eternal flame, and protected by a vow that no one would leave until the surface world was pure again. Spoiler, they never came back, which honestly doesn't speak highly of our progress. There are also tales of beneath-the-surface betrayal. In Germany, one recurring motif is of a hidden village betrayed by a single sound. A child crying, a pot dropped, a rooster crowing too early. The invaders hear the noise, find the hidden entrance, and the entire underground settlement is destroyed. The lesson is always the same: silence is survival. These stories were passed down not just as cautionary tales, but as moral codes, subtle reminders to the young that sometimes survival depends on more than just clever digging. It depends on discipline, on keeping the secret. Some folklore scholars believe these stories reflect more than just fear or superstition. They're collective memory, distorted by time but rooted in real events. A community disappears. The reason is forgotten. The dugout collapses. The gap is filled with imagination. The only thing that remains is the sense that something happened there, something the earth hasn't let go of. And then there are the Earth Eaters, figures in medieval folklore said to have no homes, no towns, only a life beneath the ground. In Russian and Balkan tales, these beings are usually portrayed as half wild, strange but wise. They emerge from caves with knowledge no one else remembers. Some say they were former humans who stayed below too long. Others believe they're guardians of the old world, protectors of buried secrets. Children were warned not to follow voices into the forest, or you'll end up in the house of the Earth-Eater and forget the sky forever. But not all stories cast the underground as haunted or cursed. Some tell of underground sanctuaries, places where peace was never broken, where families lived in secret and grew old together, unseen by the world. In parts of Eastern Europe, certain surnames are still quietly associated with those who came from the soil. It's not an insult. It's a strange kind of respect, a recognition that someone in that family line once survived when others didn't. That their blood remembers what it's like to sleep with the weight of the world pressing down from above. These tales are not just relics. In many rural areas, stories about lost dugouts still shape the landscape. Farmers avoid certain hills. Children dare each other to knock 3 times on specific stones. Local legends claim that digging too deep in the wrong place will wake the dirt, or break the silence, usually followed by a suspicious glance at the oldest tree nearby. It's superstition, yes, but it's also cultural memory, wrapped in story and song. And sometimes the line between folklore and history blurs completely. A 19th century excavation in what is now Ukraine uncovered a sealed chamber filled with tools, clothing fragments, and an inscription scratched into the wall. "If you find us, tell the sky we remembered." No one's quite sure what it means. Maybe it's a hoax. Maybe it's real. Either way, it echoes something ancient that even when forgotten, the people of the dugouts wanted to be remembered. Not for what they built, but for how they endured. So now, imagine the last few breaths of a story too old to date. You walk across a field where nothing grows quite right, where the wind sounds hollow and the birds never nest. Locals say there's nothing there, just dirt. But you notice a slight dip in the ground, a patch of earth that feels softer underfoot. You kneel, you listen, and for a moment you think you hear it, a faint voice, a prayer, or maybe just the earth exhaling a secret it's been holding for centuries. Either way, you stand, walk away slowly, and never look back. Because some stories aren't meant to be dug up. They're meant to be left buried, exactly where they belong. Here we are, the last bend in the tunnel. You've scraped your way through history's underbelly, from cramped family shelters to full-blown subterranean cities, from soot-covered scribes to ghost-haunted chambers that may or may not be whispering your name. You've crawled, climbed, and squinted your way through the quiet marvel of medieval underground life. And now, fittingly, we end in the same place every dugout does, the unknown. Because for all we can still touch, ruined chambers, stone-lined passages, soot-blackened ceilings, most of these structures, and the stories tied to them, are still missing. Not just physically buried, but historically ignored, misidentified, or forgotten on purpose. And tonight, we're shining our last flickering lantern into that gap in the record. Let's be honest, the historical record isn't exactly kind to people who lived underground. Medieval chroniclers wrote about kings, crusades, plagues, and holy relics, not muddy peasants sleeping next to their goats in a root cellar. The very act of living underground was often viewed as something shameful, or at least too ordinary to mention. If it wasn't a grand crypt or a holy hermitage, it just didn't make the cut. And so, entire communities, decades, maybe centuries of resourceful living simply vanished from the page. Even modern archaeology has struggled with this. Dugouts, by their very nature, don't preserve well. Dirt caves in, wood rots, clay walls erode. Unless someone dies dramatically inside one and leaves a datable artifact, the space fades into the soil like it was never there. Many natural depressions or odd tree clusters in old forests might actually be the ghosts of dugouts. Silent floor plans, cradled in loam, mistaken for sinkholes or animal dens. Some scholars believe that tens of thousands of medieval dugouts have been lost entirely, either built over, ploughed under, or collapsed and absorbed into the landscape. And of the ones we do find, only a handful get studied properly. There's a recurring problem. What do you call a hole in the ground with signs of human use but no obvious structure? Is it a shelter, a mine, a food cellar, a cave someone just squatted in? Labels matter. Without the right name, these places don't get attention, They get passed over, forgotten again. But the story doesn't end with the academics. In recent years, there's been a quiet, steady rise in local investigations. Amateur historians, rural communities, even metal detectorists stumbling on signs of medieval life below the surface. Not the fancy kind, the dirt and scrape kind. In fields, woods, and rocky hillsides, people are rediscovering what's been under their feet all along. Some have found spoon-carved tunnels, still bearing the imprints of hands. Others have uncovered burn layers indicating long-ago cooking fires, or soot-stained ceilings hidden behind root webs. One shepherd in Slovakia stumbled into a partially collapsed dugout with a half-intact hearthstone, scorched black and surrounded by fragments of broken ceramic bowls. There were no coins, no treasure, just a whisper of a meal cooked hundreds of years ago. And then there's the awkward truth. Some of these sites were destroyed on purpose, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. As modernity crept across Europe, anything that reeked of peasant life or backward living was razed or filled in. In some places, underground homes were legally outlawed, deemed unsanitary or shameful. Authorities wanted straight roads, clean lines, and stone above ground. The muddy, irregular underground world didn't fit that aesthetic, so it was paved over, built upon, or forgotten. Whole histories erased in the name of progress. But here's the thing about the underground. It resists erasure. Slowly, quietly. You can build over it, but the gaps still shift, the cracks still form, and sometimes something pokes through. A stone, a timber, a story passed down in a family that sounds like nonsense until someone finds an old doorframe under a tree and realizes, oh, this wasn't a fairy tale, this was a flaw, which brings us back to you. Because the point of all this digging, both literal and metaphorical, hasn't just been about survival strategies or medieval engineering. It's been about resistance, in the oldest, rawest sense of the word. These people weren't passive. They didn't just cower in caves. They built their own safety in the places no one thought to look. They turned absence into a weapon. When the world said, be visible, they said, no thanks, and vanished into the dirt with everything they loved, refusing to be counted, controlled, or claimed. That's the quiet defiance at the heart of every medieval dugout. It wasn't just hiding, it was choosing a different kind of existence, rejecting the terms handed down from on high and crafting something else. A home you could cover with grass, a fire that left no smoke trail, a door that looked like just another tree trunk. It's not glamorous, it's not majestic, but it worked. So picture one last scene. You're standing at the edge of a clearing in the woods. Sunlight filters through leaves, dappling the moss. There's no sign of anything man-made, until your foot hits something solid. You kneel, brush away a layer of leaf litter. Stone, carved, deliberate. You clear a bit more, the edge of a threshold. Faint soot marks near the bottom. You look up, around, then back down, and for just a moment you swear you feel it. Not just the shape of a room, but the shape of a life. A mother tending a fire, a child tracing a mark into the wall, a man listening for danger before pulling the hatch closed. You stand, the forest quiet again. The earth has swallowed the details, but not the memory, not completely. And now you know the secret too, that for hundreds of years, beneath war and winter and fire and fear, there were people who simply said, we'll make our own world, and carved it into the earth with their bare hands. So here you are, back above ground, in the hush after the story. The dirt has settled behind you, the last torch has gone out, and the path upward has brought you back to the surface, where the sky stretches wide and indifferent. But even now, even as you breathe in the air and shake the dust from your thoughts, the weight of it lingers. The long winding tale of the people who once chose, or were forced, to live beneath your feet. And not just live. Thrive. Endure. Carve lives in silence where the world above had grown too loud, too violent, or too broken. You may never stand in one of those old dugouts yourself. You may never run your fingers over a soot-blacked ceiling or find a spoon left in a cracked clay bowl nestled in the corner of a forgotten chamber. But now you know they were there, that for every grand castle or marble church there were hundreds, maybe thousands of quiet places underground, places without names, built by hands we'll never know. Places where people whispered stories, boiled cabbage, made love, wept, gave birth, and sometimes died. Sometimes alone, sometimes together, but always with the earth holding them close. And that's the strange comfort of it. These weren't just emergency shelters or war hideouts. They were expressions of belief in the self, in community, in the ability to survive without permission or approval. They were small, determined rebellions against a world that didn't always make room for the vulnerable, against violence, cold, starvation, injustice. And each dugout was a tiny answer. Not today. We will make our own warmth, our own safety, our own silence. There's something undeniably human about it. We build walls when we're afraid. We dig holes when we need to disappear. But deep in the centre of every one of those choices is hope. Hope that someone will come back, that peace will return, that the sky will open again and this time it won't bring fire. So now, as the wind rises outside your window, as the soft hum of your fan stirs the air and the room settles into sleep, just remember, somewhere beneath the fields, beneath the stones, beneath centuries of silence, the earth still holds the shape of people who refuse to be erased. And whether we find them or not, their stories are there, waiting, breathing, undisturbed. Good night. Sleep well. And when you dream, maybe dream of a tunnel lit by fire, of laughter echoing through stone, and of a door you almost didn't notice, until you stepped through, into the quiet, and knew you were home.